Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Breaking news, at least 8 people are reported to have been killed. 2,750 others have been injured across Lebanon, amongst them numerous members of Hezbollah. This after the pagers they used to communicate suddenly exploded. Amongst the injured, the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon. These explosions happened simultaneously in Beirut, elsewhere in Lebanon, and in parts of Syria. Also ahead, Donald Trump blames Democrat rhetoric for whipping up hatred against him. This in an interview on X. And in Europe, floods from Storm Boris turned deadly and forced people to leave their homes in search of shelter. Welcome, thank you for joining us. So that breaking news we bring you straight away in Lebanon, where we understand that at least 8 people have been killed. More than 2,750 others have been seriously injured. This after the pagers used by Hezbollah members to communicate exploded in multiple locations across Beirut and elsewhere in Lebanon. Well, hospitals have been inundated with wounded people requiring urgent care. Amongst those reported to have been injured, the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon. Well, one Hezbollah official says the detonation of the pagers was, quote, the biggest security breach the group has ever been subjected to in nearly a year of conflict with Israel. Well, for all the latest on the ground, we can cross to Beirut and speak to our correspondent there, who's from the L'Orient today, Sally Abu Al-Joud. Thank you so much for joining us, Sally. What's the latest you're hearing at this stage?
So, like you mentioned, so far there's been thousands of people wounded after their pagers exploded. I was present at several hospitals in Beirut where patients were flooding the premises, many of whom had severe injuries in their faces and in their hands and in their genital area. Doctors have told me that it was possible that they received, they were paged, or they felt that their pager was overheating and they went to check it when it exploded.
Yeah, and I mean, Sally, surely this situation took everybody by incredible surprise, a great sense of shock. What is the mood like in Beirut this evening?
People are still trying to process what happened. Until now, hospitals are overwhelmed and people are still trying to understand what happened. It remains, no one has claimed the attack so far.
And what are we hearing from Hezbollah, for example?
Hezbollah has said that this has been the biggest security breach. They have said that many of their members were injured when this happened.
Yeah, okay, so and several injuries. And we've also heard as well, I believe, Hezbollah saying that Israel will pay a heavy price for this. That's one of the sources I'm hearing quoted as having said. Sally, stay with us. We'll speak now to our guest who's here with us in the studio, Dr. Eli Al-Hindi. You are an associate professor at the College of Security and Global Studies at the American University of the Emirates. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, a pleasure.
It does appear this was a highly sophisticated attack, a remote attack. Have you ever seen anything comparable to this?
Not really. I haven't seen any of that. We know the technology is there. We know that Israel has attacked individuals in this manner before, and other players also around the world. But this mass and this size of the operation, more than 2,750 operations exploding in the same time, this, I think, is unseen before. And we're waiting to see what would be the consequences of such an attack. Really worrying.
And when you look at who was targeted, and more importantly, where they were targeted, we're talking about southern Lebanon, the east of the Bekaa Valley, the southern suburbs of Beirut. These are all areas, aren't they, where Hezbollah has a strong presence. So there's not really any doubt in anybody's mind as to who the intended target was.
No, of course not. I mean, this is the closed network of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah's operative. That's why there's also in Syria the same explosions. So it's a closed network used by Hezbollah's operative and close allies, like, for example, people in the Iranian embassy, and thus the hurting or the target of the Iranian ambassador being hurt also in one of the explosions.
What message do you think Israel's trying to send here?
I think it's very clear that for Israel in the past few months, it has become very clear that a wide-range regional conflict is not permitted or welcomed at this stage. So Israel, I think, is benefiting from every single occasion to mark points, to get to targets, and eventually achieving the ultimate aim of weakening Hezbollah's ability to cause a threat to Israel. I don't think that Israel will allow a peaceful settlement that will return things to the status quo ante, in the sense that Hezbollah continuing to be at the border and continuing to cause a direct threat to Israel, even in the deep geography of Israel. So I think they're using anything they can, and for the first time using new tactics to weaken the abilities of Hezbollah, to make sure whenever things stop, if they stop, they would be in a situation where Hezbollah have much weaker ability to cause a threat to Israel.
Stay with us, Dr. Al-Handi. I'd like to go back to Sally, who is there in Beirut, standing by for us. Clearly, there will be a lot of anticipation there, Sally, as to how Hezbollah responds to these attacks. Any indications as to what Hezbollah might do? What are we hearing?
So far, there hasn't been any threats made by the group. I think everyone, including the group in Lebanon, as well as families, as well as citizens, are still trying to process what happened. Nothing like that has ever happened before, including throughout the war since October 7. I think we just have to wait and see what Hezbollah's response. I would say maybe we would expect a speech soon or a more elaborate statement.
And obviously, given the context of what's happening on Israel's northern border and on Lebanon's southern border with Israel, I mean, was there a sense of inevitability that something on this scale could be being planned by a hostile force?
Not really. I would say no. We've been following the news on a daily basis in the south and the conflict. We did not see any signs of any attack as the one we saw today happening. We didn't see any threats. We didn't hear of any threats. We did not see any indication that we did not even imagine something like that would happen. When we started hearing the news, we were even wondering what these pagers were for. They were used by the Hezbollah members.
Yeah, I want to ask our guest here, Dr. Al-Hindi, in the studio, why are Hezbollah members carrying pagers? I mean, it's technology that, in many people's minds, will date back to the 1980s and 90s.
I'm not a security expert per se, but definitely we know that, as I mentioned earlier, this is a closed network for Hezbollah. They avoid using internet per se. They avoid using the cell phone because all of this has been proven to be, could be breached. So I think they thought that pagers are a safer measure in that sense, and using such a closed network will keep them safe. Obviously not, as we see. Just a quick comment on what Sally was saying. I think we were able to see a culmination of events in the past couple of weeks since the big attack in Homs on the missile industry that was being built there, and then news of Iraqi militiamen and Houthi militiamen coming into southern Syria, and then last, or maybe yesterday actually, the visit of Hochstein to Israel and the obvious failure of that visit. So I think things were culminating, and we were expecting something big to happen. We were not sure what and how. Of course, nobody expected this kind of an attack. But I think, again, there's a big willingness in Israel to attack on a larger scale, whether in a big full-scale war or not. I don't. It could be if Israel could achieve what it wants without a full-scale war that could cause a lot of damage to its soldiers, then why not? If such an attack have been able to handicap a big part of the Hezbollah leadership, then Israel is unfortunately achieving its objective in that sense.
Stay with us. I'd just like to go back to Sally for one more quick question. I mean, Sally, if you could just bring us up to speed on the situation in Lebanon, the latest numbers you're hearing, how this is being covered on the media there in Lebanon. Also, just tell us what the situation is at the hospitals one more time.
Mm-hmm. The latest I've heard, the health ministry said that there's been around 2,750 people wounded, and the latest I've heard was 9 people were killed. The hospitals across Beirut that I've seen and across the country in the south and in the Bekaa are overwhelmed. But because of what's been happening in South Lebanon, hospitals were prepared for such a scenario or for a scenario where it involved a war. But they also required more equipment that the health ministry were supplying them with. Again, everyone's still trying to process what happened. Outside the hospitals, dozens of people, dozens of family members are distraught, are waiting impatiently for the patients in the hospitals.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Beirut-based journalist for L'Orient Today, Sally Abu Al-Joud, thank you very much. Indeed, really good to get the latest from you there. Dr. El-Hindi here with me in the studio. Early reports suggested that these paging devices were bought by Hezbollah fairly recently in the last couple of months. This looks like a highly carefully planned attack, a coordinated attack. It's no coincidence that they all exploded on the same day. Is that somehow a humiliation, do you think, for Hezbollah? It raises serious questions, doesn't it, about their security apparatus?
Definitely. It is a big embarrassment to Hezbollah. But same as all the previous attacks that have hit the heart of Beirut, that have hit the heart of Tehran, as we said, we're really witnessing a huge gap in the technology and the abilities of the Israeli critical attacks in that sense. And unfortunately, this is also says a lot about the readiness of Lebanon to receive, big numbers of wounded or injured or killed people. Lebanon is really not ready economically and technically and practically for a big war. So if such an attack with 2,000 people injured has caused such a chaos, can you imagine what will be a full-scale war impact on Lebanon altogether and the Lebanese people and the Lebanese civilians who unfortunately find themselves stuck in this war that they had nothing to do with or decide whether they are part of it or not.
Stay with us, Dr. El-Hindi, because I'd like to cross back to Beirut, and we can speak now to Makram Rabah, who is an assistant professor of history at the American University of Beirut. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us at very short notice. Thank you, Professor. What's the latest you're hearing, just if you've got any further details to add on what happened? And could I just put that question I put to Dr. El-Hindi here first? How might Hezbollah respond to this?
Well, Hezbollah will simply use its old bag of tricks and say that they will wait for the right time and the right moment to retaliate. Over the last year or over even the last decade, Hezbollah and the entirety of the so-called Iranian axis of resistance has proven to be technologically very unadvanced. And what we have seen today is particularly proof of that. And what happened today in the streets of Beirut and even all the way to Damascus is an earnest reminder that we are living in a kind of a Hollywood espionage movie. Decades ago, we used to see these on TV and assume that this will not be a reality. Hezbollah is a consumer of technology, whereas Israel is a manufacturer of such security technologies. And it's actually not a security operation as much as a kind of a psychological warfare on not only people who claim to be fighters of Hezbollah, but the entirety of people who support Hezbollah, because many of the people who were targeted were not only security operatives, but also people who were part and parcel of the healthcare system or even the education system. So all of a sudden, this so-called unsophisticated tool of communication was transformed by Israel to a kind of a lethal weapon to remind everyone and to mutilate. And this is what's important. Moving forward, when people who claim to be supporting Hezbollah look around the room, they will see people who are mutilated, people who have lost limbs. And this is a very important reminder that we are not playing war. This is real warfare, and people will die if this continues in a kind of a attempt by Iran and its axis to actually play out the clock. The Israelis will not simply surrender unless they are given political, diplomatic, or even military assurances that it's the so-called Hezbollah threat on its northern border is contained to a certain extent.
So what you're saying, Professor, is basically this is a message from Israel to Hezbollah and those that support them that nowhere is safe and there is nowhere to hide. Is that the essence of it, at least part of that psychological message you were talking about there?
Yes, Tom, indeed. And to add to this, I think it's a message to the American administration, particularly to Biden and to Amy Hochstein, who was in Israel yesterday, that while the U.S. administration has prevented Netanyahu from a full-scale land invasion, this has exempted what we call kind of surgical hits, because the attack today was not against Lebanese. Everyone who was attacked, minus a couple of innocent children who happened to be playing with their father's pages at the time, were people who are officially part of Hezbollah. And in the sequence of events and the logic of the international community, Hezbollah has decided to open the front on October 8th. And what the people of Lebanon, who are hostages of Hezbollah and of Iran, are being reminded of, that they need to take a kind of political stand to prevent Iran and Hezbollah from further pushing us into this so-called quicksand.
And Professor, obviously it depends who you ask, but what is the sort of overall public perception in Lebanon towards Hezbollah? What do ordinary Lebanese people think of them? Has that opinion changed, in particular, with relation to what's been happening in Gaza?
I have said this, and I've said this over and over. Hezbollah are powerful not because of their weapons, but because of the sectarian system over time and their use of the clientelist system. In addition to bullying and their actual arms, they have been able to convince a big majority of the Shiites, not the entirety of them, that they are their only so-called safety net. And in this way, it is unscientific and perhaps illogical to ask someone who lives under a Hezbollah-controlled area what they think of it. So the margin of measuring Hezbollah's popularity does not rest in its ability to fight Israel, which it hasn't done for a long time, but the ability that as a so-called, as a presumed political actor in Lebanon, it is hugely responsible for destroying what remained of the Lebanese state, be it their turning Lebanon into a narco state and thus isolating us from our economic environment, particularly the Arab Gulf, or their role in the money laundering and the disruption of the entirety of the banking system. So at the end of the day, I don't really care what Hezbollah supporters say. It is preventing people from holding it accountable at the polls through corruption or through bullying. And the reason why Lebanon has been drifting in limbo, Tom, is the fact that Hezbollah and its allies have been preventing the democratic election of a president.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Makram Rabah, Assistant Professor of History at the American University of Beirut. Thank you very much indeed. I'm still here in the studio with Dr. Eli Al-Hindi, Associate Professor at the College of Security and Global Studies at the American University in the Emirates. Thank you for staying with us. Is there a danger, just picking up on what we were hearing there, that an attack like this could somehow galvanize public support for Hezbollah and perhaps an outpouring of sympathy, given that, you know, as we were saying, it's not just Hezbollah members. There were children and innocent people caught up in these attacks, and possibly some health workers as well.
That's true. Of course, our condolences to all the civilians who died in the act and who are completely innocent from all of that. But unfortunately, I have to agree with my friend, Dr. Makram, on the sense that the general environment, the general vibes in Lebanon are that Hezbollah has dragged Lebanon enough into wars and conflicts. And now the big embarrassment is that the biggest rhetoric of Hezbollah being fighting Israel and defending the Shiites, both of them have collapsed in the sense that they have not been able to cause serious damage to Israel or to, go ahead as Hamas did in a sense of a direct attack. They have decided not to do that, or they are too weak to do that, and this collapses their theory that they can eliminate Israel in few hours or few days, as they have said before, them and the Iranian regime. And on the fact of protecting the Shiites in Lebanon and providing them with a suitable safety net. This has proven that their villages have been destroyed, their leadership have been killed, without the ability of seeing any bright future in the long stand.
Dr. Al-Hindi, this is my last question. Does today's series of events take us a step closer to that regional, broader conflict that many had feared at the outset of the war in Gaza? Or do you think it shows that Hezbollah is not a force to be reckoned with? Lots of noise, lots of rhetoric, and they simply can't deliver the threat that they claim to be able to deliver?
This is actually the million-dollar question, Tom. Nobody can answer that. We are definitely playing on the edge. Some of the facts that we can read is that Iran is not willing to enter a direct confrontation with Israel because of what's happening with their negotiation with the USA and other factors. So Iran is out of this direct confrontation. Will there be a broader confrontation between Hezbollah, other militias present in Syria, and Israel? Yes, this is probable. It's becoming more probable every day, especially with the kind of attacks that Israel is doing and the kind of triggering that Israel is doing in order to benefit from the time and try to achieve its long-term goals in that sense. So yes, unfortunately, we are closer to a larger scale conflict, but definitely not the regional conflict that includes Iran and other states.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
You.
Dr. Eli Al-Hindi, Associate Professor at the Global College of Security and Global Studies at the American University of the Emirates. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Let's just get a recap of what we know at this stage. Lebanon is accusing Israel of orchestrating today's attack, which has killed at least 8 people and injured up to 3,000 others. Around 200 of the injured are in a critical condition. Well, it's not just in Lebanon. There are reports of exploding pagers in Syria as well. It appears that the lithium batteries used in those pagers used by Hezbollah overheated and exploded. As we were hearing from our correspondent in Beirut, lots of hospitals now at full capacity there. The Lebanese Red Cross saying more than 50 ambulances have been dispatched to try and treat the injured. We're keeping a close eye on that, and we'll bring you more as we get it. Moving now to some other world news. 2 days after a second apparent assassination attempt in as many months, Donald Trump is back on the campaign trail today. He's been spending today in Michigan, whilst his Democratic rival Kamala Harris has been in the key battleground state of Pennsylvania. Well, referring to the latest scare involving her rival, Harris said that she strongly condemns political violence, calling it unacceptable. Trump had previously pointed the finger of blame at Harris and President Joe Biden, citing their rhetoric about him. But Trump has then gone on to say that he has had, quote, a very nice call with President Joe Biden about boosting security service protection. Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by our correspondent there, Caroline Malone. Caroline, lots of moments of heated rhetoric. And then last night, what sounded like a rather reconciliatory set of words from Donald Trump. What is the mood today, do you think?
Well, certainly people are still very concerned about this attempted assassination attempt on Trump over the weekend. But certainly from Trump's campaign, we have heard a bit of back and forth, both with regard to suggesting that the rhetoric of the Biden presidency, but also the Harris-Walz campaign has in some way led to this, vulnerability to violence. But absolutely, as you point out, Trump said himself he was in a live stream event on Monday night promoting a new cryptocurrency, and he spoke about this phone call he had with President Biden and spoke about the event itself, praised the Secret Service and the agents that protected him, and said he had a very nice call with Biden. He couldn't have been nicer. And also that Trump had expressed to Biden the importance of increased protection, suggesting he needed more Secret Service agents. And that's something that we know that President Biden has already agreed with. On Monday, Biden spoke about the need for more resources. That's also something that's resonating through Congress. There's even a bipartisan task force that was already looking into the attempted assassination of Trump back in July in Butler, Pennsylvania. They will now take on board this more recent attempt and hopefully in a bipartisan way come to some conclusion. But yes, both sides back and forward accusing the other of using some way inflammatory language to make the situation worse. But overall, there does seem to be consensus that protecting these candidates is ultimately the most important thing here.
And just briefly, if you will, tell us what the two candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, have been doing today.
Well, despite, this potential violence from the weekend, Trump is determined to carry on. He seems to be, from his, what his campaign aides have said. He is rallying in Michigan. He's there alongside his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance. They know, of course, it's a crucial state, a swing state, in which getting voters there could make all the difference when it comes to the election. And then we've got Kamala Harris doing much the same. She's in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, another key swing state. She'll actually be speaking in about an hour to an association of black journalists. That's a similar event, actually, that Trump spoke to in Chicago a few weeks ago. He had some missteps there, potentially offending people, especially by questioning whether Kamala Harris is in fact black. But I'm sure it will be an important demographic for either of them or both of them, because that's quite an important way in which people decide how they're going to vote, listening to these people in person. But it does come down to the swing states now, and it's clear from the campaign agenda, whether it's Michigan or Pennsylvania. Later in the week, Trump will be in New York and Washington, D.C., and then on to North Carolina. It's clear that these campaigns now are very much focused on the swing states. OK, Caroline Malone in Washington, D.C., thank you very much indeed for bringing us all the latest on what's been happening there. Well, let's get some more analysis now. We can speak to David K. Johnson, who is a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology and also a Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times journalist. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor. You're also the author of The Making of Donald Trump, amongst other books. We're about 7 weeks away, aren't we? We're exactly 7 weeks away, actually, from Election Day. Just how atypical would you say the current political climate is there now?
Oh, there's nothing like this in American political history. There has been violence in American political history, starting with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln 159 years ago. But this campaign and the way folks have lined up on both sides is very unusual. It represents long building issues in America in which those at the top several percent of the population have done incredibly well. And the vast majority of Americans are no better off than they were 50 years ago.
I mean, lots of inflammatory language being used. Is it coming more from one side than the other, would you say?
Oh, it's absolutely coming more from one side than the other. J.D. Vance, the vice presidential running mate of Donald Trump, has acknowledged, for example, that the stories he helped spread about legal Haitian immigrants kidnapping pet dogs and cats to eat them are false, but he's defended that kind of falsity. And Donald Trump, way back in his 2016 campaign, on more than one occasion urged his fans to beat up black people in the audience or critics in the audience, at one point promising he'd pay their legal bills, which he would never do. That's something you have not seen at all from the Democrats.
Well, to defend J.D. Vance, the vice presidential running mate of Donald Trump, he says the left needs to tone down the rhetoric. He says the hate speech, and I had a guest on our program yesterday saying the hate speech all seems to be coming from the left, and he cited Hollywood and actors and musicians as being the ones really peddling that, as well as the media.
Well, I'm not responsible for what you say. And candidates aren't responsible for what actors and other celebrities say. But the candidates themselves in the 16, 20, and 24 elections on the Democratic side have not said anything calling for violence, whereas Donald has made numerous statements that I've documented at the time and in my 3 books, my trilogy on Donald, where, in fact, he's stoked violence, he's encouraged it, and shows no shame about it. I mean, that's not unusual for Donald, who I've covered since 1988, when way back then I wrote about the prospect of his becoming the American president.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because of our breaking news. We're way over time, so I really appreciate you taking the time to wait and speak to us. David K. Johnson, Professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, thank you very much indeed. Let's get a quick check of some other stories we're following for you now. And severe flooding across Central Europe is now known to have resulted in the deaths of at least 21 people. This follows on from a system of torrential rainfall, which has left behind it a trail of destruction in the Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Austria. In Hungary, the authorities have set up mobile dams to protect against flooding from the River Danube. During the course of the past day, the city of Nysa in southwestern Poland has become a particular focus of attention for emergency teams. This after the river there broke its banks. 226 people are known to have been killed. More than 70 others are reported missing in Myanmar. That's the result of last week's typhoon Yagi, which triggered flooding and landslides right across Southeast Asia. The death toll from that severe weather system now stands at more than 500. A typhoon has brought havoc to Shanghai, forcing more than 400,000 residents to evacuate. Typhoon Bebinka, believed to be the strongest storm to hit the region since 1949, downed trees and brought with it travel chaos, forcing all flights at Shanghai's two main airports to be grounded. Let's get a quick reminder of our top stories here on Al Arabiya. At least 8 people reported to have been killed. 2,750 others have been injured across Lebanon, amongst them numerous members of Hezbollah. This after pagers they used to communicate suddenly exploded. Well, amongst the injured were the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon, and the explosions happened simultaneously in Beirut as well as elsewhere in Lebanon and in parts of Syria. And just bringing you the latest there that we've got for you from Lebanon. At least 8 people known to have been killed. Upwards of 2,700 others have been injured after pagers used by Hezbollah exploded, it appears, almost simultaneously, not just in Lebanon, also reports of these explosions happening across the border in Syria as well. A tense situation there this evening, as we've been hearing from our correspondent and as we've been hearing from analysts here in the studio. It remains to be seen how Hezbollah will respond to these attacks, which it blames Israel for having orchestrated. So that's the latest we have for you on that situation involving those exploding pagers. We understand they were equipped with lithium batteries, which overheated and then spontaneously combusted. Several people injured there in Lebanon and in Syria as well. Hospitals overwhelmed by the numbers of casualties. So that's what we've got for you at this stage. The latest from Lebanon on those pagers used by the Shia militant group Hezbollah, which exploded, resulting in multiple injuries. Well, we have a website, alarabiya.net, where you can find all the news in English as well as in Arabic. So do check that out as well. That's it from me. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned if you can.
The acting director of national intelligence under Trump, who is often described as Trump's shadow secretary of state and a key figure in his re-election campaign, granted Al Arabiya News this exclusive interview. We aim to get insights from him on Trump's strategy in the presidential race and what the world can expect if he wins. Mr. Grenell, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
How would you assess the performance of Trump's campaign, and to what extent do you think it resonates with the American people?
Well, look, I think the Americans, as well as people around the world, recognize that Donald Trump delivered peace. He delivered peace agreements between Arabs and Israelis. He delivered a peaceful border and a peaceful economy that really gave people prices that they could afford at the gas pump and in the grocery store. And they want to be able to have those policies back. We're tired of war in America. We see ourselves embroiled in now 2 wars, one in the Middle East and one in Europe. And this is the direct result of the Joe Biden-Kamala Harris team. So Americans are really looking for peace and prosperity, and they know that Donald Trump will deliver that.
In recent polls, we've seen Kamala Harris making some gains. What do you attribute this to, and what advice would you give regarding this trend?
Well, they just had the Democratic convention, and they just switched out from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris without a Democratic primary, I might add. And so there is excitement amongst Democrats. But if you, and I would add the media is completely on her side. But if you look at the polls, you will see that independents, people who are not necessarily voting straight Republican ticket or straight Democratic ticket, the people who look at the issues and go back and forth, the independents, as we call them, they haven't moved towards Kamala Harris. They know that she is inexperienced and very far radical left. She comes from San Francisco, which is the most liberal, progressive, far left city in America. And they know that that's her values, and she's very out of step with the Midwest.
In a previous interview, Harris mentioned that she would consider adopting some of Trump's policies. This move has made her appear more centrist, potentially appealing to undecided or independent voters. How do you view this shift?
Well, look, you're right. She is trying to talk like she's a moderate, and she's embracing some of Trump's policies. But there's only one reason for that, is that her campaign sees the internal polling and sees that they are not doing well. She knows that she cannot be who she is. She cannot be a radical lefty. She has to pretend that she is something else. But, you know, she has a policy that Americans shouldn't eat red meat because it's bad for climate change. And that may work in San Francisco, where there's a lot of vegans, but it doesn't work in the Midwest, where the swing states are, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of farmers, and they don't like her radical policies. You look at how she's changed her mind on fracking, which is a technique to be able to get oil out of the ground a lot cheaper, safer, and easier. That's environmentally friendly, and she is now embracing that by her words, but she spent her whole life pretending that fracking was bad. So the Americans see, especially in the swing states, outside of the newsrooms, Americans see that she is absolutely trying to fake her way into the presidency, and it's not working.
Some argue that Trump's aggressive and personal attacks towards her may be alienating a portion of his support base, particularly women and independent voters. What are your thoughts on this? There's also been some criticism surrounding J.D. Vance, with people saying his selection was not a favorable choice and that he could be a burden on Trump's campaign.
Well, I think that's only in newsrooms. The media are saying that. That's not what the people say. The people want a fighter. Look, the Democrats and the news media, they want a Republican who plays by their rules. They want a nice Republican who agrees to play by the rules of Washington, D.C. They want somebody like Mitt Romney. But that's not who Republicans want. Republicans want a fighter. And I will say this about Donald Trump. Not only is he a fighter, but he doesn't start these fights. He responds to people. You look at the Kamala Harris and Barack Obama campaigns, and they have been vicious in personal attacks towards Donald Trump. The media doesn't focus on their attacks. What the media only focuses on is how Trump responds. But Trump does not start these fights. He defends himself. And Republicans want a fighter. We don't want somebody who's going to back down and be defined by the left or by the media. And so we like Donald Trump fighting back. He's a very kind man, and he doesn't start these fights, but he's willing to fight even harder when he's attacked.
What's your take on J.D. Vance?
J.D. Vance is a friend of mine, and he's fantastic. You know, we have a problem in the United States with middle class and poor communities not getting enough attention. And the way that Washington, D.C. has responded is to literally talk about economic issues for people who are struggling as just a issue for the Black community or the Latino community. It's a community problem for every single race, including white people. And when you look at the Midwest, there are a lot of individuals who are struggling economically, people who are Black, brown, and white. J.D. Vance grew up extremely poor. He grew up from a mother who was addicted to drugs, and his grandmother raised him. There's an amazing movie that I would say that people should watch called Hillbilly Elegy. And it's the story of J.D. Vance. And when you see how J.D. Vance grew up extremely poor and was able to build himself up through strong women in his life, and he was able to work his way through to go to Yale Law School, one of the premier schools in America, you have to understand that he is living the American dream. And the media don't want to tell you that story. They want to just pull out quotes from, 10 years ago where he was making a joke. But I think there's one difference between Republicans and Democrats right now is Republicans like to laugh. We like humor. We tell jokes, and we're not offended by that. And right now we have this woke left that doesn't want to hear jokes, and they're trying to shut down comedians. And they're just unhappy people. And I have to say that we need to bring back comedy. We need to bring back humor, and people need to lighten up and get along and realize that comedy and humor has a great place in our society. It lightens us up.
سؤال سريع أستاذ جرانيل حول
A quick question, Mr. Geller. This time around, Elon Musk is backing Trump's campaign. To what extent do you think his support will make a difference, especially considering the media bias that both you and the Media Research Center have highlighted as unfair against Trump?
الأمريكي غير منصف بالنسبة لترامب.
Well, look, one of the reasons why the previous owner of Twitter, now called X, one of the reasons why they kicked Donald Trump off Twitter was because he was going around the media. He was going directly to the people. He was telling his view without it being edited by a newsroom. And we think that that's really important. And now that Elon Musk, a Democrat, has taken over Twitter, now called X, Elon Musk has realized that our country is in bad shape from all these far left woke people, and he's endorsed Donald Trump. We had Robert Kennedy Jr., a very staunch Democrat, come out and endorse Donald Trump. I think it's because people realize right now that the Democratic Party is really radical. They have gender ideology that is weird. We have a Supreme Court justice who was just put on the highest court in the land, and she couldn't define what a woman is. It's really disheartening when you look at today's Democratic Party. It's so far left and so far radical that Democrats are joining Donald Trump's campaign.
Turning to foreign policy, you're seen as the top candidate to become the next Secretary of State under Trump. What is Trump's message to Muslim Americans and Arab Americans who are looking for a clear stance on the Gaza war, especially since Harris seems more aligned with the popular sentiment on this issue?
Well, I would push back a little bit and say that I don't think Kamala Harris is just looking at the public mood. I think she's missing what the public is saying in many ways. People want peace. They know that Donald Trump delivered peace. The Democrats and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are left trying to talk about a ceasefire because there's a war going on. And Donald Trump is saying, look, I don't think a ceasefire is good enough. I want total peace, and that's what we're pushing for. I think it's really important for Arab Americans, and that's who we're focused on, that will vote in November. I think it's really important that Arab Americans look at the CNN interview that we waited for Kamala Harris to do for more than 30 days. She said last night to CNN that she will continue the failed policies of Joe Biden when it comes to Israel and Gaza. We have a terrible situation that's going on right now. We've had 300 days almost of a war that is brutal. And we have to have leaders that know how to stop these wars, that know how to bring both Israel and the Palestinians and all of the Arab communities together to say, stop this war. And I think what Kamala Harris said last night is she is going to continue the Joe Biden policies, which are totally failed and have given us wars. She's not going to change anything. And that means we are going to have a lot more conflict going forward. To me, what she was saying last night is that she's giving up on Michigan and the Arab community in Detroit, that she's got nothing else to give them, and that she's giving up on Michigan and just going to concentrate on Pennsylvania. And I think that she also is signaling that she very much regrets not picking Josh Shapiro as a running mate, because he is the governor of Pennsylvania, and he would have been able to really deliver Pennsylvania in a way that I think Tim Walz, her current vice president, can't.
What's even more important for Arabs and Muslims, in general, is the two-state solution for the Palestinian issue, which Trump doesn't seem fully convinced by. What is Trump's vision for ending the Gaza war and achieving a solution, whether it's a two-state solution or a fair outcome for all parties involved?
Well, first of all, Donald Trump will say that you just have to look at his 4 years in office, where he delivered multiple Arab-Israeli peace agreements. We didn't have these wars because of one reason. We didn't fund Iran. Iran is a destabilizing figure. Iran funds, when they have money, the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. And that's exactly what the Biden team did. They gave the Iranian regime hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief, cash, credit, a whole bunch of things. And Donald Trump had decided that we needed to squeeze Iran because when they get money, they produce wars. Now we're in this situation where we have this horrific war. It's got to stop. And when people talk about a two-state solution, of course, we see the vision where there is a peace agreement and economic development for everyone in the region, including Palestinians. But you can't talk about a two-state solution when you have Hamas, a terrorist organization, leading one side. It's unacceptable. And you will see Americans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, being very clear that Hamas is not good for the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people deserve a unity government that takes care of them, that fights for them in a peaceful way, that doesn't produce wars, but produces economic development and security and prosperity for its people. And that's the vision that we have. And right now, you can't talk about a two-state solution when one side is literally holding people hostage.
But in the presence of the Palestinian Authority, would you accept a two-state solution, one side being the Palestinian Authority and the other being Israel? This is the proposal agreed upon by all Arab nations, as stipulated in international agreements. Would you accept this, which all Arabs are advocating for?
Well, what I would say to you is get rid of Hamas. Right now, they're in a leadership role, and no Western country is going to be able to deal with Hamas.
Regarding Iran, you've mentioned the topic. What is your plan to deal with this issue, especially given your strong criticism of Biden's approach to Iran? What would be your first step on day one to confront Iran?
Well, we have to go back to squeezing Iran, bankrupting Iran, making sure that they don't get money, and having the international community united. Donald Trump was criticized by a lot of Europeans when he said, stop doing business with Iran. And we think the appeasement of Iran comes from many in Europe, where they want to continue doing business because it's good for their economies. But they fail to see what Iran is doing with that money. We've seen it. We see the destruction in Lebanon. We see the chaos in Syria. We see what the Houthis do in Yemen. And it's unacceptable. And what Donald Trump wants to see is peace. And to have peace, you have to go to the source of what's happening and how the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, where they're getting their money from. And they're getting their money from Iran.
Some argue that Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear agreement gave Iran the opportunity to enrich uranium at an unprecedented level. What's your response to this claim?
No, I served at the Security Council at the UN for 8 years, and we were very vigilant to make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. They don't have a nuclear weapon right now, and that needs to be a policy of both Republicans and Democrats. We need to make sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon, that they don't have this breakout moment. I fear that the money that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have given to Iran is feeding their program, and they're becoming closer to a nuclear weapon because of all of the money that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been able to give to the regime.
Is the use of force on the table to deal with a nuclear Iran?
Well, look, you're talking to a diplomat. You're talking to somebody who's worked at the State Department for 12 years. You can ask the Pentagon and military officials about that policy. I want to see a peaceful agreement. I want to see a Secretary of State and a State Department, a national security advisor, and an entire team that's focused on peace and diplomacy as much as war. You look at what's happening in Ukraine, for instance, and we only have one discussion, which is how much more money should we give to further a war. We have very few diplomats out front talking about peace deals. And that's my criticism, is I think that we have plenty of people making sure that America has a very strong Pentagon, but we have too few making sure that the diplomatic arm of the United States is pushing for peaceful solutions before we have to resort to military action.
On the Ukraine issue, many are concerned that Trump may push for a solution at Ukraine's expense, which could end up benefiting Putin. What's your response to these concerns?
I don't think that history shows that. I think history shows that Donald Trump believes in peaceful solutions, that we had the strongest possible sanctions on Russia. We stopped the Russian pipeline going into Europe, which was called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It was the Democrats and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris who decided to take away the sanctions on Putin's pipeline. That created instability, and I believe that that was the first step in creating a space so that the Russians invaded Ukraine. They caused this war, if you will. And so I think that when Donald Trump says he's going to solve these problems, he's got a history of being able to solve them very quickly. I'll finish with this, is that there's a difference between a threat and a credible threat. If Joe Biden gave a threat of sanctions or military action or tariffs, for instance, not a lot of people believe him. But when Donald Trump threatens tariffs or sanctions or military action, people believe him. He's got a credible threat.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Welcome to this special interview. For decades, the Middle East has been known as a region constantly on the brink of security and political upheavals. Here, issues and perspectives often intertwine in ways that are complex and unclear, making the need for deep, realistic explanations essential. Today's guest once described himself as neither an optimist nor a pessimist, but as a realist. This realism comes from nearly 4 decades spent in high-level military and governmental positions, including leading U.S. Central Command, the multinational force in Iraq, and serving as the director of the CIA. His extensive military and strategic experience are encapsulated in his numerous writings and research, with his latest book being a New York Times bestseller, Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. General David Petraeus, former CIA director. General Petraeus, welcome to this special interview on Al Arabiya English. Let me start with your recent statements where you indicated that a full-scale war between Israel and Iran is unlikely due to the mutual fears of potential destruction for both nations. However, the question is, do you believe that this reason alone is enough to prevent an escalation between Israel and Iran, especially considering that many in Israel suggest that Tel Aviv is seeking to use this time to strike Iran before it acquires nuclear weapons?
لتوجيه ضربة لإيران قبل حصولها على أي أسلحة نووية.
No, I do stand by that. But full-scale war between Iran and Israel, and also involving Lebanese Hezbollah and perhaps some of the other Iranian-supported militias in Iraq, the Houthis, of course, Hamas, it's not impossible. I did say when I was commanding the surge in Iraq that I was neither an optimist nor a pessimist, but a realist. And then I added that the reality is in Iraq and the Middle East that it's all hard all the time, but hard is not hopeless. In this case, I do think that Iran and Israel and Hezbollah have worked their way through the damage that either side could do to the other and realize that full-scale war would bring an enormous amount of death and destruction. Could Israel indeed do enormous damage to Iran and also, of course, to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon? Yes, absolutely. But each of those countries has considerable capacity. Each of those entities, Hezbollah, obviously not a country, but Hezbollah does have over 130 or 1,000 or so missiles, rockets, and so forth, some of them with large warheads and considerable accuracy. And if enough of these are launched at one time, they could likely overwhelm the very sophisticated layer air and ballistic missile defense of Israel. And there would be considerable damage and destruction. Certainly Israel will do even more to Hezbollah, but again, damage and destruction on both sides. And the same would be the case with Iran. I think right now what each of the parties is doing is waiting to see if there might be a ceasefire reached in the ongoing negotiations. Of course, the U.S. Secretary of State is in the region. Negotiations reportedly are taking place today in Doha, Qatar. I think unlikely that we'll get an agreement in the next days or so, but I don't think it's impossible that an agreement could be reached in the next few weeks. That probably would be in the interests of all the different parties. Iran in particular, I think, with a new administration that was hoping to reach out to the Western world instead of going to war with Israel, I think is particularly hopeful that a ceasefire could provide an excuse, if you will, for them not to have to carry out some major escalation of the conflict between Iran and Israel that would result in a major escalation in Israel's response.
General Petraeus, you mentioned that Iran would be compelled to respond because of the strike that was seen as an attack on its national honor, particularly after the assassination of Ismail Hani in Tehran. But how do you think Iran will respond?
I suspect the decision has actually not been made. I'm sure there are different factions within the regime and the Iranian government that are arguing for different types of responses. And again, you have a brand new president, you have a brand new cabinet. They're still just getting established. Obviously, the real decision-making, the real power rests with the supreme leader and others right around him. But again, I think they're very likely considering a number of different options and also recognizing what Israel's response would be to each of those different courses of action. And I suspect, again, no final decision has been made, in part because they're also waiting to see what happens with the negotiations around a ceasefire with Hamas.
You also mentioned that Israeli intelligence has once again demonstrated its expertise in infiltrating various elements within Iran. But the question is, has Tel Aviv managed to restore the deterrence it lost significantly after the events of October 7th?
Well, that was a truly traumatic event. I'm not sure that in America we fully understand and appreciate just how significant it was. Keep in mind that we lost nearly 3,000 individuals in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent of what Israel sustained for the United States would be 40,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage. And of course, the way that this attack was carried out, the brutality, the inhumanity, the barbarity, filming it, rape and so forth, were all absolutely just unconscionable. And again, it has inflicted a trauma on the Israeli people. It's the worst day in their history. And they obviously are still hard at work trying to achieve the original stated objectives were to destroy Hamas and to ensure that it never governs Gaza again, and also obviously to get their hostages back. Each of those is still a work in progress. Hamas has been significantly, very substantially degraded. The fact that Israel now controls the Philadelphia corridor, the border between Gaza territory and Egypt and the Rafah crossing is a very significant achievement for them because they now control access completely to Gaza. It's much more difficult for Hamas to reconstitute itself when it comes to weapon systems, ammunition, explosives, and so forth. But they do continue to reconstitute themselves in terms of personnel because Israel is conducting clear and leave operations, essentially raids into Gaza and then generally pulling back out. And Hamas is able to reconstitute. And of course, there's a lack of security inside Gaza right now, which means that it's very, very difficult to, in an organized fashion, provide humanitarian assistance, restore basic services, begin reconstruction, and so forth. All of that really requires security. And the current strategy does not appear that it is going to be able to achieve that. So that is a challenge that they have. And also, again, in terms of governance of Hamas, we still don't see the kind of political end state that the Minister of Defense of Israel and former Minister Benny Gantz and others have called for. That still has not been laid out. And I agree with them that that is much needed. And then obviously the ceasefire negotiations, a primary objective of that for Israel's side is, of course, to get the remaining hostages back, noting that 6 more bodies were recovered in the last 24 to 36 hours by the Israeli Defense Forces. So there's still a great deal of work to be done there. And there are a lot of unknowns there as to what, again, the political end state inside Gaza will be. And without security, if you truly don't control that, then again, providing humanitarian assistance and so forth is extraordinarily challenging. Hamas's and criminal elements are essentially still the guys with guns, if you will, the authorities, such as there is any, inside the territory, and very difficult. No Arab countries are going to go in there in a situation like that. International organizations find it very difficult to operate. And of course, you're not going to be able to bring in other Palestinian security forces because they don't want to get into it with Hamas. So again, a very challenging situation, one that is still not complete. It's still very much a work in progress. And the vision for which has still not yet been provided.
طيب على يعني تعقيبا طبعا على كل ما قلته جنرال بطريوس أنت كان
General Petraeus, following up on what you've said, you previously commented that your personal experience in managing armies involved in counterinsurgency campaigns should serve as a warning to the Israeli army if it decides to proceed with a ground invasion, suggesting that such operations typically take a decade or more, as we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. Do you genuinely believe that the Israeli army might need a decade for operations in Gaza?
لعقد من الزمن لعمليات في غزة؟
Well, it depends on the effectiveness of the security operations. Again, Hamas has been dramatically degraded. There's no way they can conduct the kind of attacks that they conducted in the past. Hamas is a shadow of itself when it comes to military capacity, but it still exists, and it is being reconstituted in terms of its personnel, at least. There's Hamas 2.0 being formed. The sooner that Israel commits to truly securing it, creating, if you will, gated communities, such as we did within Fallujah, Ramadi, Baku, and noting that Gaza is more difficult, fiendishly more difficult, because of the underground tunnel system of over 350 miles worth, than all of those that we did during the surge in Iraq put together. But the only long-term solution possible would rest on the achievement of security. Once you have security, then you can bring in international organizations, and you can bring in Palestinian security forces from the West Bank that, say, the U.S. will train, perhaps oversee. You can bring in non-governmental organizations. Arab forces will come in then. Contractors can be used to augment the Israeli Defense Forces and so forth. But that vision has not been laid out, despite, again, Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant and former Minister Benny Gantz calling for something along those lines, at least laying out what the long-term vision is for Gaza. It's very premature to say whether this is a decade, years, months, what have you. It certainly will be years, given the extraordinary amount of work that has to be done, not just in a military and security sense, but in a civilian sense, in terms of the restoration of basic services, reconstruction, schools, markets, clinics, roads, houses, bridges, and so forth, and really overhauling every aspect of the education system and other social elements inside Gaza that Hamas so perverted during its time in charge of the territory.
General
Petraeus, let's take a step back in time, focusing on part of this discussion that we'll draw on your latest book, starting with Afghanistan. You stated that Operation Enduring Freedom, which aimed to topple the Taliban and destroy al-Qaeda, would, after achieving these goals, see the Bush administration focus on stabilizing Afghanistan and creating a free society governed by a democratically elected government. After all these years, have any of these goals set by the United States been realized?
Well, it was achieved for 20 years. It was certainly imperfect. Aspects of it were maddening. Our partners were frustrating. There was corruption. There were innumerable challenges. But I would submit that the population, the vast majority of the population in Afghanistan, was in a vastly better situation when we were still on the ground with a modest number of forces, having not even lost a soldier in the final year and a half we were there until the terrible suicide bombing at Abbey Gate at the airport, we didn't have to withdraw. We easily could have sustained what it was we were doing. All of our coalition partners wanted to stay, but our withdrawal led to what was inevitable, which was a collapse of the Afghan security forces when the operational readiness of the linchpin of that defense strategy, which was the helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft that transported the 35,000-strong commando force to reinforce and augment security forces that were under attack by Taliban around the country. And I think that that was tragic. I think that what we see in Afghanistan now is an ultra-conservative 9th century interpretation of Islam. Half the population can't go to high school or college. That same half can't participate particularly meaningfully in society or the economy outside the house. And half the population is starving. So again, I think the situation as we see it is exceedingly dire. Millions and millions of Afghans have voted with their feet and left the country. And we easily could have stayed. So what was set out to be achieved, I think a fair amount of that was achieved. There were peaceful transitions of power, however long they took and however much the argument over that. The same, frankly, in Iraq, where there have been numerous peaceful transitions of power. One took, to be sure, 9 months. But a country that in many respects right now, economically, is doing very well. Albeit not as well as it should, given that it's one of the top 5 oil exporters in the world, and yet still can't completely provide 24-hour electricity power to its people. But coming along,
طيب يعني سنأتي للحديث عن العراق جنرال بتريوس,
which is to Lebanonize Iraq, to achieve in Iraq what they've achieved in Lebanon with a powerful militia on the streets and political power in the parliament. If it can avoid that, and I think that the majority of Iraqi parliamentarians do want to avoid that, I think there are good prospects for Iraq. Again, however imperfect that outcome may be as well.
طيب بكل تأكيد سنأتي على العراق لأنه
We will indeed get to Iraq, especially since you dedicated an entire chapter to it in your book. However, looking at Afghanistan first, you likely followed the recent military parade by the Taliban, where American helicopters, armored vehicles, and weapons were prominently displayed in Taliban hands in Afghanistan. Do you not think that the Taliban having access to such weapons poses a global security threat, or even a threat to U.S. security, if not now, then in the future?
No, I don't, actually. I think that was a nice parade. But again, it poses no threat. It does pose a threat to its neighbors in that it has not controlled its territory sufficiently to prevent the growth of the Islamic State Khorasan group, which of course carried out the attack in Moscow, showing that it has the ability to carry out attacks well beyond the borders of Afghanistan and the region described as Khorasan. It also has not been able to keep the Tariqi Taliban Pakistani, the Pakistani Taliban, from establishing sanctuaries in the mountainous regions near the border, if you will, the Durand line between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And of course, it is a failed state in a number of different respects, which means that it's a burden on its neighbors with huge numbers of refugees in Pakistan, others in some of the other countries that surround it, including Iran. But I don't at all see it as a threat to the United States, except in as much as it is incapable of keeping the Islamic State from developing its ability to carry out extremist attacks beyond the actual region and all the way, again, into Moscow and perhaps all the way into Europe at some point. And that is worrisome.
Let's turn to Iraq. And you devoted an entire chapter to it in your book. Reflecting on history, you criticized the Coalition Provisional Authority led by former U.S. Ambassador Paul Bremer. arguing that he lacked significant knowledge about Iraq or the Middle East, making him an unfortunate choice for the role. To what extent do you think Bremer's selection contributed to the failure of U.S. plans in Iraq during that period?
Well, first of all, I would submit that we didn't fail to achieve our objectives in Iraq, although the decisions by Ambassador Bremer shortly after he arrived and assumed the role as the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority were absolutely catastrophic. And I should just note here that I served in Iraq, of course, as a two-star general, as part of the invasion commander of the 101st Airborne Division, the Firqi Wahid. Then came back shortly after that year, did another 15 months as the head of the train and equip mission as a three-star, then home for a year, and then came back to command the surge in Iraq for 19 and a half months as a four-star, then was at Central Command, so still overseeing Iraq and all of the greater Middle East, and eventually the CIA director when we withdrew our final combat forces from Iraq in late 2011. So this is a country with which I have had a lot of experience. I have often said Ana Iraqi, Ana Maslawi, because this is where I spent the first year of the war after the fight to Baghdad. Ana Shamari, that was the tribe, which I liked because it had Shia as well as Sunni in it. But look, I think eventually, by the end of 2011, Iraq was actually in a very good place. But it took the surge in Iraq, it took a commitment to reconciliation to remedy what Bremer had actually done all the way back in the spring of 2003, when in a disastrous series of decisions and policies, he decided to fire the entire Iraqi military without telling them how we would enable them to provide for themselves and their families. And then he compounded that by firing the Ba'ath Party, Saddam's party to be sure, and the first two levels of that certainly should have been cast out of Iraq and those individuals actually detained. But when you got down to level 4, this was tens of thousands of bureaucrats, many of them Western educated, precisely the people we needed to help us run a country, which we did not sufficiently understand. And he fired them without an agreed reconciliation process, and that was the real flaw. So there was no redress for them. They were just out. And as you would appreciate as a fellow Iraqi, every job in Iraq at that time was a government job. Every university was owned, paid for by the government, every major industry, just about everything, with the exception of a few minor little shops, was controlled by the government in some fashion. And so to throw everyone out of an opportunity for a government job was absolutely catastrophic. And again, it was not remedied until during the surge in Iraq, when I instituted a reconciliation process to remedy that situation.
General Petraeus, you mentioned that President Bush hoped to see Iraq become the South Korea of the Middle East, an ally of the United States with a democratic government and a free economy. In your opinion, is Iraq today even remotely similar to South Korea? Some argue that in the end, you handed Iraq over to Iran.
Well, there's no question that Iran was one of the big, if not the biggest winners of this. Obviously, a minority Sunni kleptocratic dictator was deposed who controlled a Shia majority country. And naturally, you're going to have a Shia political leader if you have a democratically elected government. So I think that's indisputable. And I always thought the idea of turning it into South Korea in a couple of decades was wholly unrealistic. That doesn't mean, however, that there were not significant achievements in Iraq. And if Iraq can navigate this very challenging period right now, where, as I mentioned earlier, you have their large neighbor to the east trying to turn them into Lebanon by controlling the parliament and having a powerful militia on the streets, if they can avoid that, I think they can actually have a reasonably bright future. And I'm still somewhat optimistic, actually, about the Balad Rafidain, the land of the two rivers.
طيب فيما يتعلق بالشرق الأوسط جنرال بيتريوس أنت
Regarding the Middle East, General Petraeus, you commented that the U.S. efforts to leave the Middle East are akin to Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. There is no way out except through deeper involvement. However, some argue that while the U.S. continues to increase its presence in the region, this increased presence does not align with the interests of the moderate states in the region, and that Washington is no longer listening to its allies, leading to more mistakes being made to correct previous ones.
وبالتالي هي تعالج الأخطاء بالمزيد من الأخطاء أحيانا.
Yeah, I just don't agree with that. Again, we have been far from perfect over the decades. I was there over the decades and watched this very closely inside the Middle East and from the outside. Again, we've had missteps. We've also had successes. I think that we do listen carefully. I think not as carefully as we might have at various times. But I think the involvement in the region right now is very, very substantial. My argument has not been that you have to go deeper. My argument has been that you should not continually try to leave and tell the countries in the region that you're trying to leave to focus completely on the Indo-Pacific. Instead, we need to recognize we need to maintain a consistent presence, a consistent commitment, and indeed ensure we know who our enemies are and who our friends are. Iran is our enemy. Gulf states, Israel are our friends. And never confuse the two. Recognize there may be differences of opinion at times, but our overall objectives are consistent and aligned, and continue in that kind of approach with a stable, solid presence, and providing our partners and allies with as much as we possibly can when they ask for it.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Coming up on the show, Donald Trump blames Democrat rhetoric for whipping up hatred against him and, quote, causing him to be shot at as the FBI continues its investigation into Sunday's second attempt on the former president's life. With the cost of everything and worries of a recession weighing heavy on the minds of American voters, the US central bank's deciding whether to lower rates. We'll get into why that matters. And staying with economics, speaking to the man many associate with radical proposals pushed forward too fast. Former UK Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng joins me for a chat. Welcome to the show. Now, Donald Trump's claimed rhetoric from Democrats, particularly Vice President Kamala Harris, is responsible for a second assassination attempt against him. The former president making those comments in a post on social media, attributing recent threats to the, quote, communist left rhetoric, arguing their words have taken political hostility to new levels.
There's a lot of rhetoric going on. Right. A lot of people think that the Democrats, when they talk about threat to democracy and all of this. Mm-hmm. And it seems that both of these people were radical lefts. The first one, they should learn more about. They have apps that they haven't opened yet, which is pretty strange. Right. And the father went out and got the biggest lawyer in the state of Pennsylvania, which is pretty strange, about the father of the shooter we're talking about in Butler, the first one. And that's pretty strange. There are a couple of pretty strange things going on there.
Well, for more on the latest details, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by our correspondent there, Caroline Malone. Caroline, great to see you. Look, Trump, as we were hearing there, making those statements about Democrat rhetoric in a social media video. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, he absolutely has been doing that, as has his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance. We were hearing Trump in social media, and he's been speaking in different forums over the last few days, one of which was a live stream that was on Monday night, in which it was a pre-planned event. He was talking about a new cryptocurrency business that he's releasing with his family. And he took the opportunity to criticize Harris and Biden and blame them in part for what he calls this rhetoric that's leading to political tension. He also, though, went into more detail about the experience of what happened to him when he was on the golf course, talking about how excellent the Secret Service were, how quickly they acted, and that he was with a friend. And he said as soon as the Secret Service agent with him heard the first gunshot, they protected him, and he really applauded that. He also talked about the witness, who was the person who actually saw the suspect fleeing from the scene, took a photo and found also the car license plate, which then they gave to security officials. And that led to the eventual arrest of the suspect, as we now know. So really, we've been hearing some praise from Trump for the Secret Service, also some blame for the rhetoric. He also, though, spoke about how President Biden had called him and they'd had a phone call. He described it as very pleasant. The White House said the same. It was very cordial. He said Biden couldn't have been any nicer. But he also said he expressed to Biden that he feels he needs better protection from the Secret Service. And that is certainly something we've also heard from President Biden on Monday, who suggested they need more resources.
Have we heard anything else from the Democrat camp, from the Democrat side of things? I mean, Trump's language, as you've talked there, it's been pretty strong, blaming them for their rhetoric and saying they're pretty much the enemy from within, but then seemingly having a very pleasant phone call with Biden thereafter. So have there been any other comments from the Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, it is very contradictory in a lot of ways, isn't it? We've certainly heard initially after this second attempted assassination of Trump from both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, who've condemned any form of political violence. They've been very strong on that statement and also calling and applauding the Secret Service for their action and calling for more support for the Secret Service. But on both sides of the aisle, you know, there has been strong rhetoric. This is a very tense election campaign. We're in the final 6-7 weeks. Both sides have been strongly criticising each other. The frame of the line that the Democrats have been using more often than not is that Trump is a threat to democracy. Certainly, I guess it's open to interpretation if that does incite violence. And potentially, once we know more about the suspect, he'll be back in court next week and then in 2 weeks' time for an arraignment. Once we know more about his motivation, perhaps there'll be more understanding of what actually led him to decide to go to that golf course and try to, we think, shoot at Trump. So very important to find out more of this detail here. There is also, though, separately, a bipartisan task force in Congress. That is a group of both Democrats and Republicans who've met and who have been meeting since the first assassination attempt on Trump, since the Butler, Pennsylvania rally. And they are trying to look through the security detail, trying to review what happened, trying to get to the source of these problems. They've also said they, of course, will be looking at what happened on Sunday to Trump in this second attempt. So there is a group of bipartisan lawmakers as well who are willing to come together, putting politics aside, to try and do the right thing and ultimately make sure that these political candidates are protected.
Now, of course, this story has taken up much of the attention, much of the focus around this election race over the last 48 hours or so. But surely the candidates and the parties are up to other things as well, with only 49 days or 48 days to go until the election. What is on their agenda at the moment?
So Kamala Harris is actually in Philadelphia today. She's attending an event with black journalists. That is a key demographic, voter demographic for her. And of course, being in Philadelphia, that's in the state of Pennsylvania, a key swing state. So she's taking another opportunity to reach out to voters in a swing state that are ultimately going to be deciding who wins this election. Recent polls, particularly over the last 24 hours, have shown that, as we thought, Kamala Harris did very well in the debate against Trump, and that has actually boosted the numbers nationwide, something like up to 6% ahead of Trump in some polling nationwide. But it really comes down to the swing states. It's all about who decides to vote for either Harris or Trump in these swing states. So Harris in a swing state on Tuesday. We're also going to see President Biden in the same swing state later in the week. We've got J.D. Vance, who's campaigning in Michigan, another key area where there's a battleground state there, trying to gain as many voters as possible. And that, I think, is how we're going to see the rest of this campaign play out over the next few weeks. Because ultimately, if they can win, either candidate can win 3 or 4 of the swing states, that really puts them in position to end up back or into the White House.
And Caroline, just finally, elsewhere in the show, we're talking about the economic impact of inflation and sky-high costs of living on this election. The Fed having a meeting could cut interest rates. Will this have any impact on the race?
Well, the economy is a huge deal for voters here in the United States, particularly inflation and the cost of living. That has been top of mind for many voters over the last few years, and it's certainly a campaign issue that Republicans in particular have campaigned on. They've spoken and criticised the Biden administration and, of course, by extension, Vice President Harris, because they see their economic policies as making the situation worse for people in the United States. So with this Fed meeting, we are likely to hear about interest rates cuts. The question is, how far will those interest rate cuts go? But off the back of it, the implication is that inflation is coming down, which is leading the Federal Reserve to decide that they are in the right place to do the rate cuts. And that is another campaign item that Biden and Harris could potentially use to their advantage, because they can express how the economy is recovering and how it continues to recover, particularly post-pandemic, but in a way that is sustainable, in a way that hasn't led to any form of recession, but also crucially bringing that cost of living right back down for people.
Caroline Malone speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you. Well, for reaction to this, I'm joined now by the chair of the Republican Party in Texas, Abraham George. Sir, thank you for making time. And let's get straight to it. Another, quite frankly, terrifying event in the lead up to this election race. On Sunday, with another apparent attempt on Donald Trump, this time at his golf course. Now, since then, Donald Trump actually talking in a Fox News interview in the last 24 hours or so, blaming the Democrat Party's rhetoric, specifically Harris and Biden, for causing him to be shot at. Do you agree with that?
I do. Democrat Party and their leaders, Hillary Clinton including, have been pushing this narrative that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy for the past many years. Now, if you tell someone, this is the guy who's going to destroy America so many times in so many ways and for so many years, people will feel like, okay, they're going to have to take care of this. And that's what's happening. The rhetoric is causing a huge divide in the United States. And, end result is things like this. There's enough crazy people out there who will do something stupid like this. So that's absolutely, the entire country agrees with this now.
Picking up on that word they used, destroy, because within that very same interview, Donald Trump accusing the Democrats of wanting to, quote, destroy the country, calling them the enemy within and saying they are the real threat. Could that also be classed as dangerous rhetoric?
It is. When we have leaders from Democratic Party calling one group of people neo-Nazis and white supremacists and nationalists, it can be, and it goes for all of us, right? You don't go into, but if it is factual based, Democrat Party currently have no base in calling anything about Democratic, because their presidential candidate is not elected not even by a single Democrat. Joe Biden was their candidate. It was on the ballot. 16 million people voted for Joe Biden. I think 14 million people voted for Joe Biden. There was not another choice in that ballot. There's a few others who didn't really make it, but Kamala Harris was not on that ballot. It was basically a coronation of Kamala Harris. That's what took place at the DNC convention. So Democrat Party cannot claim to have any democratic process in their own party anymore. That ship has sailed. So the rhetoric in politics have gotten way too much into the danger zone these days, and this is creating all kinds of problems in our country.
I mean, when we talk about, let's talk about a bit more about that rhetoric, because you mentioned there those words like white nationalist, supremacist, right-wing, far right-wing, in other countries as well, those on the right side of politics, by which I mean the right-hand side, often make the same complaints. They don't want to be called far right or extremist or fascist, but at the same time, we hear the terms communist, socialist, far left, those types of things used in reverse attack almost. Do you think that's sort of adding to this sort of atmosphere of hostility?
Not really. Communist is not a we don't call someone communist by looking at their color. We don't call someone communist by looking at their background. We call communist based on policy. That is a policy position. White supremacist is not a policy position. People have called me white supremacist because I'm part of the Republican Party here in the United States. And they haven't seen me, so they just make that assumption just because I support the Republican Party, I'm a white supremacist. That is a danger. When you have a communist ideology, of socialist ideology, a Marxist ideology coming from a leader, then calling them that, it's not a bad thing. Call a spade a spade. So it's very simple.
How do you feel being called a white supremacist?
Well, I laugh at it because it's an interesting twist. And then one time a major newspaper wrote that about me, and I sent them a picture of me standing at the RNC. And, they sent me a apology text saying, sorry, we did not know you were a person of color. That was basically what they said. And I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm an American. That's all matters to me. And that's what's supposed to matter when it comes to journalism, not the color of the people.
Really interesting. Thanks for answering me on that. It was just interesting picking up on what you said there. In terms of social media, let's talk about the effect that that's having on all this sort of hostility, this venomous political debate, because Elon Musk, the world's richest man, owner of platform X, arguably the most important political debate platform out there, he had to apologise on Monday for actually tweeting about an observation about the fact that there's been no assassination attempts against Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. And do you think that kind of thing is unhelpful at the moment, or do you think it's just a harmless joke?
Well, I don't know what Elon does, honestly, but be honest with you, calling for someone's assassination, regardless of whose party you were in, and I'm glad he apologized, that's not the right thing for our country. What we need to work on is the policy differences, because in the United States, as you know, inflation is so high, people are having a hard time going to grocery store, affording regular things like bread and butter and milk. We got to work on those things. We've got to work on gas prices. We are in a place where our inflation is so high that people are having a hard time going to work and coming back. So an average American wanted to hear about things like that, but not necessarily. I mean, nobody wants to hear about a leader, regardless of which side of the spectrum you are, calling for assassination of their opposite party or ideology. That is just not helpful or not good for the United States at this point. Honestly, not good in any country. So why would we do that here in the U.S.?
I'm glad you brought up the economy, because we're doing a special focus on that in our show tonight. And we're going to be speaking to a former trade representative about that. But in terms of people potentially getting distracted then from the main policy points, which is what you sort of seem to be suggesting here, is that, the average needs of the average American voter aren't being looked out for. It's just a lot of politics and slang and name calling and things like that. How do we lower the tone, do you think, on those exchanges and get the parties to focus on what matters?
Well, the Republican Party is focused on that. I mean, what a lot of people see in the mainstream media is just the sound bites. And honestly, I blame the media for that. because media's job is to go into the policy and dig deeper and say, okay, where does this party and where does this candidate stand on policies? Look at when President Trump was in the office. 4 years was one of the best 4 years of the United States. And look at when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris was in office. It was one of the worst 4 years of the United States. So it's very simple to look at policies in such a way, but media wouldn't do that. I'm not blaming you, but most media, mainstream media, would rather talk about small thing that doesn't really matter to an average American. That needs to focus back to going back, and media needs to do their job on that, along with the parties focusing on things like economy, border, inflation, things like that, instead of talking about random things and name calling. And I think the adults in the room have to be better than that. Unfortunately, today, it's not the case because that's what's selling. And unfortunately, the parties and candidates are moving in that direction. So we got to come back into policies and positions where it helps or hurts helps or hurts the American people, and look at it and see what are our solutions.
Do you think there are adults in the room, there in the White House in Capitol Hill, that are actually getting these policies dealt with, and that what we're seeing, what is being portrayed in the media, what we're seeing from the candidates, is just a sort of front-facing theatre?
It is. A lot of times, again, for media, it's sound bites because you guys got to work on your rating. And for the party, we are always worried about our candidates and their polling. Everyone is somewhat selfish in a lot of areas, and that's why, as a leader in the Republican Party, I really want to talk about policies. What does it mean to have President Trump back in White House versus Kamala Harris back in White House? If that happens, we will have an economy that is failing and probably at a brink where we will have World War III because we have so much going on all over the world. We got to talk about all of those specific issues, which is what we are focused on. All of our ads going out these days are not really talking about all these tiny sound bites. We're talking about policies and our platform. Where do we stand on open border? Where do we stand on gender modification of our children? Where do we stand on a school choice? There are so many things that are happening in the United States that needs to be talked about in the public square. So that's what we're focused on. We're not doing the name calling. We're not doing any of those stuff. At least not in the Republican Party of Texas.
I was going to talk to you about that. You're chair of the Republican Party of Texas. Talk to us about, it sounds like you've got a very clear mandate of what you want to achieve in your role. But what is it like there? What are the Republican members saying to you? What are they looking to hear from in this election?
Well, they're looking for two things. One, we've got to win the election. So that's the main thing. It's just not the federal. We have our state election going on where all of our state representatives are up for re-election. Many of our senators are up for re-election. Many statewide are up for re-election. So we're working on all of those. Ted Cruz, our senator, U.S. senator, is up for re-election. So all of those matters because not only policies in D.C. matters, and also in Austin matters to us. So we're working on all of those. That's one major mandate for me until November 5th. The other is Republican Party state of Texas have created priorities. We have 8 priorities that we set together. Then we have the platform, which includes things like open border. We got to close our border. Talking about our power grid. Talking about banning taxpayer-funded lobbying, things like that. So there's so much going on, and that's what we're focused on. And they want me to, my job, the mandate is very clear, get the conservative priorities passed at the legislative session. So that's what I'm working on.
How safe do you feel in your role there, in your role as chair of the Republican Party in Texas? Because election officials, for example, there's reports of them receiving suspicious packages today. I understand they've got a completely different role in the political system to you. But is it increasingly becoming more dangerous to be in politics in America?
Yeah, both sides are worried about it, to be honest with you. I get worried about some of the times just because I travel all over the state of Texas. A lot of times it's just by myself. So a lot of times I have my staffers with me. But when we do, people are crazy. It doesn't take a lot for someone to attack you, do things like that. But, I'm secure and safe. I have people around me who will protect me, and I'm a believer in Christ, and I leave it up to Him.
And I'm assuming a believer in gun rights as well, given that you're in Texas and you are a Republican.
I do, and I do carry my weapon with me. Yes.
Interesting stuff. Look, in terms of Trump's protection, let's talk a little bit about that, because it's been a big topic of discussion. In fact, he had a phone call with President Biden today, and Trump actually saying he was terribly nice to him, Biden. He said, I really appreciated the call almost. He couldn't have been nicer, were Trump's words about Biden. So maybe potentially walking back on calling him the enemy within. But talking about beefing up Trump's security detail, Trump saying he needs, a lot more. He's got 50,000, 60,000 people showing up to events. Those are Trump's own words. Biden potentially promising more security. Do you think Trump will get that security?
I don't think he will, but mainly because the Democrat Party will not allow Biden to do that. Joe Biden, recently Trump said, Joe Biden hates Kamala Harris more than he hates me. And during the debate, and I believe that. And I think the American people believe that, because Joe Biden, everybody knows here, that was pushed out of the office, and he hated that. I mean, he was consistently going out and saying, hey, I'm running for re-election. But the Democrat Party did not allow him to do that. So it's the same thing. I don't think Joe Biden is in charge of our country. So are they going to allow him to make a decision that Trump will be protected? Probably not. I think the Republican Party is looking, and Trump's team is looking to hire private security for him now.
Yeah, I was certainly thinking private security might be sensible at this point. And in terms of what he's doing, I know you're not privy to Trump's personal diary or anything else. You don't know what's going on in his mind or his day. However, we do know he loves to play golf. This attempted attack happened on his golf course on Sunday, or within the boundaries of it. And there has been analysis that he should stop playing golf as much. Plenty of presidents have played golf, but apparently it's the frequency and ease with which Trump just walks out onto one of his golf courses that causes for concern. Do you think he should stop playing golf?
Oh, I hope not. I don't think walking away, hiding, that's not the Republican way. That's not the American way. We forced through things like this. We've gone through much worse situations in our country before, and I really hope that he is out there doing rallies and working the crowd and playing golf and whatever he loves to do. That should be a fundamental right of any citizen, let alone a former president and a candidate for the president for this term. So, yeah, I hope he will not back down on this.
In terms of what's left to go in this race to the White House, some 48 days left. We've already seen so much. I know everyone always says the American presidential election is always full of twists and turns and drama, but 2 potential assassination attempts on one of the candidates. What else could we see?
We don't know. There's a saying in U.S. it's October surprise, and we're not even in October yet. So I don't know what else is there. We are hoping to have a peaceful election and have a peaceful transition from the Biden-Harris to President Trump and J.D. Vance, but we don't know. People are crazy. We have no idea what's coming. So we're prepared for everything. We're looking for ways to protect our candidates and our elected officials, and work the crowd and talk to people and be available to American people.
Do you think it's right that there should be stepped up security, certainly on January 6th, if there is that need for a transition of power on that day?
I doubt it. I don't think when Republicans go somewhere, we don't burn down cities. That's not a thing. For Democrats to do something like that, they have, their history behind this in the last 6-8 years. They've burned down cities, police stations, police cars. So we're hoping that's not the case this time. And American people are tired of it. They're not expecting that. They don't want that. And that is one of the reasons they're losing. The Democrats are losing because of what they did in the past. And Tim Walz, the candidate for vice president, is actually a guy who actually supported this kind of things in Minneapolis. So American people are looking at it and saying, okay, if he did this as a governor, what is he going to do as a vice president? So there's a lot going on, and I hopefully there are no more violence in D.C. or anywhere else.
I mean, when I'm talking about January 6th, of course, I'm not talking about Minneapolis or violence in other cities that may have been caused by left-leaning voters. I am, of course, talking about the insurrection attempts on January the 6th a couple of years ago, and that was by Donald Trump's supporters. So then, do you think it's necessary to have stepped up security, given that this regards President Trump again?
Well, if you look at January 6th incident, you can clearly see there was some violence in one part of the Capitol, but that's not what is being pushed in the media. Media pushes into an insurrection. There was nobody walked into the Capitol with a weapon. Nobody burned down any things. People were escorted into the Capitol by the Capitol Police, and now they're facing 3, 5, 10 years of prison sentence to going into the Capitol that they own. It's their Capitol. Obviously these things are a misdemeanor in many cases. Unfortunately, that's not the way the DOJ has weaponized this incident against the Republican Party and the Republicans and the people. So I will never condone violence. If there are some people who got into that, I will not support that. But that is not the narrative the media has pushed. So for you to ask me if there's going to be another insurrection, the answer is there wasn't one last time either. There was violence and there was enough people. Nancy Pelosi failed to protect the Capitol. That was her job to do, and President Trump actually allowed and told her that she can have the National Guard. She didn't do it. So, and there's a lot more coming out, and there's an investigation committee at the U.S. House. They're looking into it. So we're still waiting to see the rest of the results on that. So I don't think there's going to be another insurrection because there wasn't one in the first place.
Just talk to me a little bit about the media, because you've mentioned quite a lot. You feel obviously there's a lot of bias in the US media, in the mainstream media, about the way that the candidates are being approached and historical issues are being approached in this election. Do you feel like there are more alternatives these days to what you call the mainstream media? For example, X or other right-leaning news platforms where you're able to get your voice heard?
I think the mainstream media, if they don't come back to actually reporting the truth and just staying out of the opinion part of the thing, especially in the United States, I think they're going to go out of business very soon because people like Elon Musk, who is pushing X, and I don't call Elon Musk a right-leaning guy. He was a Democrat, and he basically said, the party and the ideology left me, I didn't leave the Democrat Party. There are other social media platforms out there. Even the right-leaning or left-leaning social media platforms when their Zuckerberg came out and said, yes, I censored conservatives during the last election cycle. So it's not a secret to say, okay, this is happening. MSNBC and CBS and ABC and all of those guys, CNN especially, just go out and spread the propaganda against Republicans, not necessarily right-leaning Republicans, for all Republicans. Look at the last debate. Not a single question about his assassination, not even once. Trump had to bring that up one time. The ABC debate team did not think that this is going to be a thing that people wanted to hear. So they didn't care about it. They didn't want to talk about it. They fact-checked him 7 times, I believe, and not even a single time for Kamala Harris. So it is a biased media. And obviously, people are going into non-traditional media these days because of that.
Certainly they are. Look, it's been a really interesting discussion. We appreciate your time. Chair of the Republican Party in Texas, Abraham George. While the candidates and their parties continue to battle for the White House, many voters are most worried about the state of their finances at home and what's being done to help. We'll speak more about that after this break.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Well, with a cost of living crisis and worries of a recession weighing heavy on the minds of American voters, the suits at the US Central Bank are sitting down over the next few days to decide whether to lower interest rates. The Fed, as it's known, expected to join other central banks around the world in starting its own rate-cutting cycle. But what impact will that actually have? For more on this, I'm joined by former acting United States Trade Representative and former General Counsel to the US Trade Representative under former President Donald Trump, Stephen Vaughan. Sir, great to have you with us today. And I appreciate you're not a financial analyst. This isn't business television, nor are you speaking on behalf of any kind of bank or economics institute. But let's just get the obvious question out of the way. How much do you think the Fed is going to cut rates by?
Well, I mean, as you said, this is, it's a very open question, and I don't want to really opine on it. But I think most people in Washington seem to be anticipating a rate cut of either 25 to 50 basis points. And I think that's going to be what people are really looking for tomorrow.
Yeah, and that 50 basis points at half a percentage cut is quite aggressive in terms of Fed movements, normally just a quarter of a percentage move downwards. But clearly there are signals that there is sort of a cooling inflation within the US economy. However, a weak labour market as well. So some very difficult economic factors at play for them to contend with. Talk to me about how much difference it will make. Let's think about the average voter here, the people worried about their mortgages and their grocery baskets. How much of a difference could it make if the Fed actually lowers that interest rate?
So, I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on how long it takes to go through the system. So, for example, today, obviously, you're seeing some activity in the stock market, which at least a lot of the commentators believe relates to people anticipating what the Fed may do tomorrow. So some people may look at that and see that as a favorable sign for the economy. Other things, as you know, obviously when you change the interest rates, it takes longer to work through the economy. Normally, they're hesitant to make changes to the rates this close to the election. But in any event, it's not really clear at this point that you would see a significant change in the economic situation before the election.
Talk to us about the economic situation for the, I know it's a difficult term, the quote-unquote average American right now, but you have your sense of the kind of the nuclear family, maybe in a suburban home, a car, doing their average weekly shop. What are things like for them at the moment?
So basically, they came out with new data yesterday last week showing what's happened to real median household incomes in the United States. And we see that those peaked in 2019. We had a drop-off in 2020, 2021, and 2022. It started to rebound last year in 23, but it was still below the peak in 2019. So that's pretty consistent with what we've been seeing in a lot of the polling, which is that a lot of people still are pretty pessimistic about the economy. They don't really feel like things have come all the way back since the pandemic. And the real median household income totally backs that up.
In terms of coming back from the pandemic, the labour market, the US labour market being one of those key indicators and actually getting quite soft, what's called jobs reports that measure the state of labour in the US economy over the last 2 months. Not as many jobs coming up as available. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, obviously, one of the things that happened, at least the way most people here think about it, is they did have inflation a few years ago. It was the highest inflation we'd had in quite a while. In response, there was a fairly aggressive, rise in interest rates. And as a result of that, you're now seeing the sort of slowing and softening of the economy, which, of course, is what the interest rate increases were designed to do. The question on the table today is, has inflation really been brought under control such that now it will be appropriate to lower interest rates and sort of re-stimulate the economy and get things going again? And that's what the Fed is going to tell us tomorrow.
Inevitably, whenever we approach these Fed meetings or any kind of central bank meeting, whether it be in Europe or the UK or Asian economies as well, there's always conversation about how effective the central bank is in controlling inflation using interest rate reductions. what is the general sense, or maybe potentially what's your sense of the efficacy of the Fed these days? Do you have faith in it?
Well, I think certainly the evidence suggests that the interest rates, they did raise the interest rates, the inflation did go down. Most of the recent reports have indicated that inflation has been reduced. Now, their target traditionally is at 2%. I'm not sure it's gotten all the way down to 2% yet. Different measures show different things. But certainly, I think, I think they're going to say tomorrow they think that it had the intended effect, and that having had the intended effect, they don't want the economy to slow down too much. And I think that's why we'll probably see a cut tomorrow.
What about the narrative around Jerome Powell, or Jay Powell as he's often known, the Fed chair? Is there faith in what he's doing, the decisions he's making?
Well, I think it's, I think it's, it sort of depends on who you talk to, right? In other words, obviously, for the most part, the voters are still pretty frustrated with the state of the economy. The inflation still weighs on a lot of people. Wages, for the most part, over the last 3 or 4 years have not kept pace with inflation. And that's obviously been a big issue in this election. How much of that, the Fed bears responsibility for, I think it's sort of difficult to sort that out.
What do you think will be Jerome Powell's legacy?
I think a lot of it depends on what happens over the next, few years. In other words, I think if he is seen as someone who is able to steer the Americans through this and get, the so-called soft landing, in other words, bring the inflation down without having a significant effect of job losses, I think that's what he'll mostly be remembered for. If he turns out that, for example, if he cuts the interest rates and inflation shoots back up, then he may, then that'll sort of have more of an impact on how he's remembered. So I really think it's too early to say. I think we have to kind of wait and see how this plays out over the next couple of years.
Let's think now about the election, of course, coming right into vision currently with a lot going on. And whenever I'm interviewing people from the US, from your country, I'm hearing a lot of people saying the media are getting distracted by the headline-grabbing stuff. Obviously, assassination attempts are worthy of headlines, but certainly all the kind of rhetoric that's being bandied back and forth. And what we should really be focusing on is the economy, because voters are going to vote on the economy. Do you agree with that?
I think, obviously, the voters have been saying for a couple of years now that the economy is the most important issue. Inflation is another one that's always listed as a very important issue. So, yeah, I think it's impossible to really understand what's happening here politically without understanding some of the concerns that the voters have about the economy.
How much of a difference do you think lowered inflation could actually make in this election? Surely it would be something the Democrats would want to capitalize on if they can in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, the polls have pretty consistently showed that voters prefer President Trump on the economy. I think it's not likely that anything that happens between now and November is going to change that. He has a record. The current administration has a record. And like I said, if you look at the household incomes, we still haven't gotten back to where we were in 2019. So I think the voters are going to take that into account.
Yeah, and obviously, when you speak to any of the Republican or Democrat sides on this, they'll selectively pick and choose. Well, when Trump was in office, this wasn't happening, or when the Democrats were in office, they had to deal with the post effects of COVID, et cetera, et cetera. You're always going to have that argument that when certain candidates were in office, other world factors weren't impacting them in that way. In terms of Trump's record on the economy, do you think the average American voter, when they go to the polling station on voting day, do you think they're really going to be thinking, I felt richer under Trump?
Well, the polls indicate that is what most voters will be thinking. Now, obviously, then the question becomes, is that what they vote on, or do they vote based on other issues? But I think we've had a lot of polling over this issue over the last year, and in general, almost every poll indicates that the voters think he did a better job on the economy.
Now, of course, trade is your specialty, and it would be remiss of us, Mr. Vaughan, to speak to you without talking about trade policy. Donald Trump has historically been quite radical, some would say, on his approach to trade, and this was when you were in the trade part of his administration. Do you still stand by the approach that was taken at that time?
Well, I don't, and I wouldn't describe it as radical. In other words, I think what he was trying to do was to create incentives and encouragements to have, more U.S. workers and have more jobs created in the U.S. and have more manufacturing in the U.S. And I think the data indicated that he succeeded. But I think the data also indicated, he made trade deals with Canada and Mexico and Japan and Korea and China. So he was very willing to make deals when he thought those were in the interest of the United States.
The US Chamber of Commerce putting out a report post-Trump presidency saying, in terms of seeking new market access abroad for US exports, the Trump administration's record was poor. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't think that's true. And like I said, we revised the the NAFTA agreement, got a new agreement which passed overwhelmingly in the Congress. We got an agreement with China that would have given us more market access into that country. We got agreement with Japan that would have given American farmers more access into that country. So I think it was a very robust record and a very strong effort.
In terms of tariffs, because he's often known as the tariff man, Donald Trump, amongst other things, he championed tariffs, of course, and this was, again, when you were in that sort of that department at the time, and other limits on imports as a sort of tonic for wider-ranging economic ills. Do you think that's still a policy that's worth exploring and pushing forward?
Well, I think it's interesting that the current administration, pretty much agreed to keep almost all those tariffs in place. They're all still in place to this day. And like I said, if you look at the numbers, whether you look at the income numbers, if you look at the jobs numbers, if you look at sort of how the economy did, in 2018, 2019, before COVID hit, I think it's pretty clear that those policies were effective.
So how do you rate the Biden administration's approach to trade over the past few years?
I think for the most part, they stuck pretty close to what we saw during the last administration. They kept a lot of the tariffs in place as they were. And I think that they, haven't really shown a big effort to make a lot of changes there. They haven't talked a whole lot about trade in terms of what they would do in a next administration. So it's early to say in terms of what they would do next.
Hey, I was going to ask you that. Do you have a clear sense of what Kamala Harris's trade policy would look like? She hasn't really said a whole lot in terms of detail, and so she hasn't really put out a lot. And my guess is that I think she would probably stick pretty close to what they've done over the last few years, but it's really too early to say. What do you think a second Trump presidency would look like from a trade perspective?
I think he would, I think he's been pretty clear about he would like to go forward with some additional tariff measures. I think he would be, engaged in, robust negotiations with countries around the world. There's an opportunity to re-engage with Mexico and Canada on some of the issues relating to the USMCA. So I think you would see that. So I think it would be an effort again to use trade policy the same way he did in the first term, to encourage more investment in the United States, get more jobs, get more Americans back to work, and help those Americans get higher real wages, after inflation wages, in exchange for their efforts.
I know you've gone back into private practice now, essentially, but if you were back in the Trade Department under Donald Trump, what would you be advising him?
Well, obviously, I think that, that we do need to take a robust approach on trade. I think the United States continues to run, very, very large trade deficits. And I think it's always challenging when you're in that situation to get other countries to engage with you. And so I think that the approach he took before was the correct approach, and I would just hope that he would build on that.
Would you go back if you were invited back into his department?
Well, that's way too, I'm not going to speculate on that.
Okay, fair enough. What do you think a second presidency for Trump would look like otherwise in terms of other policies in the economy, but elsewhere as well? There are concerns that certain conservative manifestos put forward, for example, like Project 2025, which Trump has distanced himself from, might sort of influence the way that his presidency would be run. What do you say to that?
I think he's been very straightforward on all these issues. I think he's indicated that he would stick pretty closely to the priorities and goals that he had in the first administration on domestic policy. I think you would see an effort to encourage economic activity, but also make sure that that activity benefits workers. And we saw he was very successful in that in the first term. I think in terms of foreign policy, he's talked about wanting to be a negotiator and to bring resolutions to some of these conflicts around the world. And when he was president before, we didn't see as many of these conflicts. So I think it would just basically be a continuation of what happened in his first term.
And do you think he's going to do it? Do you think he'll manage to seal the deal?
Oh, of course. I think he has a very good chance. It's a very close election right now. But certainly, I think if the voters go based on what they're saying in terms of the economy, then yes, I think he will win the election.
Stephen Vaughan, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, the Biden administration continues to be dogged by low approval ratings over his handling of the economy, despite the country's finances being in pretty strong health. Some experts believing that a so-called vibe recession could be because Americans are still smarting from high interest rates. While Kamala Harris tries to sell the administration's record on the economy as she campaigns for the presidency, her opponent Donald Trump is looking to appeal to those voters who say they don't feel it in their pocket. From Washington, Kate Fisher reports.
The US economy is growing, expanding by 3% last year with low unemployment and fears of a recession fading. But voters don't seem to be buying it. A poll for The Guardian newspaper from earlier this year shows nearly 3 in 5 Americans wrongly believe that the US is in a recession and that the economy is shrinking.
It's just everybody's feeling it. I have 2 kids and it's hard.
Prices are higher than they were a few years ago.
Economists have given a name to this disconnect.
Vibe session is the idea that the economy can be doing quite well, but the vibes, the feelings of the people are not where we think they should be.
Harvard economist Judd Kramer co-wrote a paper earlier this year analysing why this could be happening.
The measures that we traditionally use to describe whether we're in a recession or an expansion, those are all in great shape. Unemployment is low, inflation is declining, GDP growth has been doing well. We would have expected that given those things, consumer sentiment would also be rising. But we haven't seen that to be the case at all.
That could be partly down to the effect of elevated interest rates, which have raised mortgage and credit card repayments, but which aren't included in measures of inflation. Rates are set by the US central bank and not the president, but they've left many Americans feeling pinched, something Trump is maximising on.
Are you better off now with Harris and Biden than you were with a person named President Donald J. Trump? Under Kamala Harris and crooked Joe Biden, the American dream is dead.
Harris has acknowledged people's concerns.
While our economy is doing well by many measures, prices for everyday things like groceries are still too high. You know it and I know it.
But as the sitting vice president, she will have to distance herself from that if she's to increase her support. With the US central bank not expected to lower interest rates much, if at all, by November's election, and with families still feeling the pinch, the Harris campaign may struggle to convince Americans that her party's handling of the economy is worth their vote. Kate Fisher, Arabiya English, Washington.
Economies around the world are grappling with a mix of challenges and uncertainties. Rising inflation, disrupted supply chains, and the ongoing impact of geopolitical tensions have created a volatile environment for countries around the world. From energy shortages to soaring food prices, economies both large and small are feeling the pressure, with governments and central banks navigating difficult choices to stabilise growth and curb a cost of living crisis. Amid this turbulent economic landscape, former British Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng remains an outspoken voice. In his brief tenure in the famously brief premiership of Liz Truss in the UK, he put forward radical ideas to try to stimulate economic growth. Now, this included slashing tax, freezing energy bills, and scrapping the limit on bankers' bonuses. These proposals causing the pound to fall to its lowest ever level against the US dollar and sparking turmoil in the bond markets and chaos in the mortgage markets. Kwasi Kwarteng has since defended that approach, but he has spoken also about warning Liz Truss that she was going too fast with her plans. As the world continues to adapt to rapid economic shifts, Kwarteng's time as Chancellor offers a striking example of the complex decisions faced by policymakers today, and I spoke to him about exactly that. I am now joined by the former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng. So thank you for your time. And I hope you don't mind me starting like this, but I've noticed that you've done a lot of media interviews recently in the last few weeks. It's been 2 years, almost exactly, since your time as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the short-lived premiership of Liz Truss. Is there a reason that you're kind of doing lots of media now?
Well, I've been around. I've left Parliament. I left Parliament at the general election. And there's plenty going on, and people like yourself want to hear commentary, they want to hear views, and I'm very happy to engage in those conversations. And I think people, when they listen to what I have to want to say, you know, there's an interest in that.
Yeah, there certainly are, and that's why we invited you on to talk to you, because you do have a lot to offer in terms of your vast experience, your economic knowledge, your knowledge of global affairs as well, and we will get on to that. But why it interests me that you're doing so much media now is because, of course, you end up inevitably facing the same questions again and again about your time as Chancellor of the Exchequer. What happened to the economy at the time? Some say, called it the collapse or the tanking of the economy. Some refer to as the man who screwed up the British economy. I mean, what's that like, hearing that again and again?
Well, the more I hear it, the less sort of powerful it is, because clearly that was 2 years ago. And I think the Labour Party, our opposition, made a lot of hay with it. But actually the fundamental problems we were trying to solve are still there. There's still an issue of growth. There's a real concern in the UK that at the next budget there'll be tax increases. The government are heralding that. And of course we tried to do the opposite. I think it was rushed. Looking back, I think we made mistakes. But the fundamental issues are still there. And I'm very interested in that debate. And as time goes on, I think the issue of growth within the British economy, and not only the British economy, across Europe, will become more pressing and a more fitting subject of debate.
And I find that interesting, because I have heard you defending obviously your strategy, but again saying it was rushed at the time. So if you had a chance at doing it again, would you again go for that sort of drastic action but in a different way? Was it being accompanied with Prime Minister Liz Truss?
I think it was too rushed. I've said this.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I've said it repeatedly. I think, the ship of state, to use that metaphor, is an oil tanker. It's not a speedboat. You can't move things very, very fast. I think the Prime Minister's view was that we had to seize the day in that expression. But looking back, I think we should have taken a slightly more measured approach. We can debate this endlessly. Hindsight is a beautiful thing, and history is very interesting. But what interests me now more is the future, is what is the UK going to do in the years ahead. We can talk about the mini-budget, we can talk about the fallout, we can talk about the rising interest rates, we can talk about all of that. That's interesting. But what's more interesting, I think, to your viewers, and certainly to markets, is the future. Will Donald Trump win? What will the nature of the British budget be like? What's going on in France? These are the issues. What's going on in Ukraine and the Middle East? These are the issues that I think people are very focused on. And of course, I'd be very happy to talk to you about the mini-budget and what happened 2 years ago. Well, but I think that's of less salience today than some of the other issues.
And I agree with you. I'm very much in mind of looking at the present and the future, what the current government in the UK is doing, how everything else affects that. But that's why I began the conversation in this way, because I'm interested in you putting yourself out there now. Sure. As you say, you've left Parliament, and now you're doing a lot of media interviews, and you're inevitably going to come up against that questioning of what happened 2 years ago. So let's indeed...
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer it. Happy to answer it, but I'm just saying that there's that, and also there's the present and the future, and I think people are more interested in the present and the future.
Let's then think about the present and future. Start with the UK, but we will broaden out. But talking about what's happening there, of course, the Labour government that is currently in power, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, his Chancellor, will say that they inherited a stagnant economy from the Conservatives, and now they're burdened with it, and they won't be able to achieve the growth that they want. Do you buy that as an argument for what they're trying to do?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, I left office in October 2022. Rishi Sunak came in with Jeremy Hunt. They stabilised the markets, and I think they deserve credit for that. And then, of course, this year, we're looking at figures for the UK economy, which are some of the fastest growth rates in the G7. So it's not true to say, as Labour have done, that the economy that they've inherited is a wrecking, a scene of wreckage. I think that's they do that for political purposes. But they also have said that there's a black hole. I think they came in and said there's a 22 billion black hole. But if you have a black hole, you don't then turn round and give the unions a 20% pay rise over 3 years. That seems totally illogical. To say, well, we don't have the money, we've got a deficit to plug, but we're actually going to increase public sector wages far above the rate of inflation. That doesn't make any sense. So clearly, I think they're playing politics. And in order to pay for those wage increases, they've decided to take what's called the winter fuel payment. That's an annual payment of about £300 to every pensioner. And Rachel Reeves, in a bold move, I would suggest, has said she's going to remove that. So these are political decisions. And if you were in the pressure that they say they are, I don't think they would have rushed to do the pay deal that they did.
I mean, they are political decisions, and they are those of the Labour Party, which, of course, isn't your party, so you're going to naturally probably take an opposite view on them. But in terms of the Conservatives and being the party of the economy, which they have been considered to be for many previous years and previous decades, when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, he was called the tax rise Chancellor because he just kept raising taxes. Now, you had a completely different approach to that. Was the fact that the Conservatives lost the election over the summer because they didn't have a cohesive strategy when it came to economy? It seemed incredibly divided all over the shop.
Look, I think you're right. I think there were lots of reasons. There were lots of reasons that ended Tory rule. We were in power for 14 years. There was a feeling we'd really run out of ideas. We'd had 5 prime ministers, which was an extraordinary number, and we seemed tired and out of breath, as it were. We were people who they felt the people felt they'd had enough of. They were sick of it. I think at the core of this, these difficulties, has been the COVID pandemic, because what happened over COVID was the British government, pumped in hundreds of billions. I'm not talking about tens of billions, hundreds of billions to support the economy. And as a consequence of that expenditure, there were really strong reasons to raise the taxes. And the taxes have kept rising since then. And when the Tories had the leadership contest in 2022, this was at the centre of the contest. Liz Truss said she was going to cut taxes, and Rishi Sunak essentially said he was going to keep raising taxes. Liz Truss won the contest. I was Chancellor, she was the Prime Minister. And then what we tried to do, and this is the relevance of our opening remarks, was that we tried to reduce the tax burden because it's at a 70-year high. Now, looking back, I think we tried to do too much too quickly. And crucially, there were 2 things that we got wrong. One was that we didn't get the OBR to score what we were doing. And secondly, what we should have done is had a very tight spending schedule at the same time as the tax cuts. But we chose not to do that. That was a wrong decision, in my view. And as a consequence of the market disruption, she was removed and Rishi Sunak came in. Now, what Rishi Sunak did was simply continue the path we were on. And Labour essentially are doing the same thing. They're raising taxes because they have to pay for increased public expenditure. And the growth isn't at the level that all of us want to see. And if you get slow growth, and this is the doom loop that Liz Truss described, and Labour have also alluded to this, if you don't get growth, the only way you can pay for rising public expenditure is through borrowing, which is future taxation, really delayed, or through direct taxation. And that's why the UK today is facing increased taxes in the next budget, which I think will take place at the end of October.
Look, let's indeed move on. You mentioned Liz Truss there. I know you've made it very clear in previous interviews in recent weeks, so you're not here to throw her under the bus. I've heard you kind of dance around questions where people are asking you whether you're distancing yourself from her. But I want to ask you this then. She's promoting herself quite heavily in America. We've seen her going stateside, speaking to quite controversial characters, Steve Bannon, etc. Why do you think she's doing that? Do you think that's an interesting move?
Well, look, I think she feels very strongly about the message and the style of government that she wanted to see. I think there are many people in America who are instinctively and temperamentally very aligned with a low-tax agenda, which I agree with. It's very ideological. And I think she wants to reach out to find kindred spirits across the Atlantic. And I'm sure there are many people, she has many friends in that country. And that's up to her. I mean, she's left the House of Commons, she lost her seat, and now she's making her own way, figuring out what post-parliamentary life looks like.
Will America pull you in post-parliamentary life?
Well, I've been there a couple of times. It's a nice thing to be out of Parliament, to have the freedom to travel. I'll probably be in the Gulf. I have been to the Gulf a couple of times this year already, and I look forward to travelling there. And of course, for people like yourselves, like your audience, who are interested in global politics, the economy, geopolitics, finance, all those subjects, America is a vitally important country, a great power that has a huge role to play in that world.
What interests me particularly is we're both, you can tell from my accent, we're both Brits. I'm not currently in London, you are. We can see the lovely Tower Bridge behind you there in the studio that you're currently in. But do you think, Mr. Kwarteng, that Britain still has any kind of important standing in the world? Do you think we have a voice? Do you think we have influence?
Yeah, I think we're very good in Britain, probably the best in the world, at doing ourselves down. We're very prone and very quick to criticise what we do in Britain. And it's a part of the British bashfulness, British reserve. We don't really celebrate our achievements in the way that some other countries do. But if you look at Britain today, we're a member of the G7. We're a key player in NATO. We have a seat on the Security Council. We've got the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. And there are lots of things. We've got the English language. We've got the common law. We've got a great time zone for historic reasons, but it is. So there are lots and lots of things about Britain that are very, very positive. And we're very remiss sometimes as politicians and journalists and commentators. We don't celebrate those things enough. And I'm not at all despondent or concerned about the long-term future of the UK. But I do have issues, as you would expect, with higher tax rates and a less competitive economy in the short term. I am concerned about that.
The reason I ask about Britain's standing in the world is whether or not you think there could be any type of special relationship. Obviously, there has been for years and years, but do you think it will become more special or less special if we say, for example, see Harris in the White House or return of Trump?
I think the British government is committed to working with whoever wins. It was a mistake in 2016. I think the assumption in the government and within the Foreign Office was that Hillary Clinton would win. And I think there was a feeling that somehow we'd overlooked the Republicans in the shape of Donald Trump. I think we've covered that. We've recovered that ground. I think that David Lammy will work with whoever gets into the White House, as will Keir Starmer. And I think it's a positive relationship. You look at NATO, for example. Britain is probably, arguably, the key ally in that organisation of the United States. We've committed to 2% of our GDP to defence. More than that, 2.5%. 2% is the actual NATO number. But a lot of the other partners haven't committed to that. There are whole other areas as well. If you look at what happened in Afghanistan, if you looked at our cooperation across the global politics, the US-UK relationship is very close. And I think that will be maintained whoever wins in November.
And look, you're post-parliamentary now, you said it yourself, so I can hold you to this. Who do you want to win?
I think that it's a very difficult one. I mean, clearly Trump has got a very difficult personality for many people. He's very bombastic, he's outlandish. But I think generally, for me, his economic agenda is more attractive than Kamala Harris, who is essentially, as far as I can make out, although she's keeping very quiet about this, a very strong left-leaning, socialistic, if you like, person whose approach to the economy will reflect that. I think she mentioned price controls in a speech earlier a few days ago, and that sort of language is very scary. We want an open economy. We want competitive markets. We want lower deregulation, and we also want lower taxes. That, over time, will create much more prosperity. And I think Trump marginally, well, actually by quite a bit, is more attractive on that.
Just finally, on those points of low regulation, low taxes, is there anywhere internationally that excites you economically when you think about that? We've heard Truss in the past describing wanting to create Singapore upon Thames, London or the UK. Whether or not that's possible, some would disagree. Is there an area in the world that you look at and think that's a vibrant, growing economy you'd like to replicate in the UK?
You look at Singapore. Let me just say this. And we get into trouble for saying Singapore and Thames because sections of the British media, they think Singapore is just some giant, industrial dystopia, where there are sweatshops and people being exploited and it's a terrible place. Quite the contrary. Singapore, in 1965, which is only less than 60 years ago, was essentially a swamp. I mean, there was nothing there. And in 60 years, through visionary leadership, particularly with Lee Kuan Yew at the helm, they've built a country, a civilization that is extraordinary in terms of wealth, in terms of education, in terms of the opportunities that it gives its people. And that was done not by over-regulation or a very, very high tax burden, but by lower deregulation, allowing the market, allowing people's abilities to find expression, and also through very competitive tax rates. So I think Singapore is completely misunderstood in sections of the West. I think it's an incredible human success story. And when we look back at the 20th century, I think Singapore, the story of Singapore, will be one that will fill people with a lot of hope and admiration.
I find it interesting, the Singapore comparison, because I've worked there for 2 years as a news anchor, so I've lived there. I was there through COVID. I've seen it inside out and back to front, and it's not upon me to have an opinion or to cast any opinion on how it's done. But the critics of that argument is that, yes, whilst it's a success story, it is done in a way that is at odds with the British system of sort of free democracy and everything that comes with that.
Yeah.
It required a certain form of hard leadership from the top, and what I'm asking is whether you think that would even be possible to replicate somewhere like the UK.
No, so you're quite right. Look, I wasn't talking about Singapore as a political beacon. I was talking about the economic significance of the country, its performance, and also the fact look at where they started. I mean, they didn't have many resources or much in the way of a kind of natural endowment, if you like, in 1965. The story of that country is pretty remarkable, and I would definitely recommend anyone listening and watching to find out more about it. But you're right, the political environment in the UK is very different. We have a pluralistic democracy that's been entrenched for decades now, if not centuries. And the approach is different. But some of the things that they're doing in Singapore, I think, are impressive and should be emulated. All countries have different circumstances. They've got different histories. They sometimes have different forms of government. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from other countries in this very diverse world that we have.
Certainly, I think it pays to look at other models and other styles of doing. I'm just interested to know about the real-life application of it. Look, you did mention the Middle East previously. We have an interest in covering the area, of course, as all news channels do at the moment, because of the situation there, especially in Gaza. How much do you think this is going to impact the outcome of the US general election?
I think it will quite considerably. I mean, it was very notable to me that at the beginning of the year, President Biden and Harris, the administration, had a much more, to my mind, pro-Israeli policy. And you looked at the primaries. I mean, the Democratic primaries weren't competitive. But in Michigan, there was a huge number of people who didn't vote for Biden. And clearly, I think there was a worry that the high Arab American population in Michigan wasn't going to turn out sufficiently for the Democrats to ensure that they win the state in November. And of course, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, these are three key battleground states that represent the Midwest and the old industrial heartland. So there were political reasons for them, I think, to pivot away from a kind of blanket, blank check approach to supporting Israel. And I think they're much more sensitive to the aspirations of people in the Middle East, the Palestinians, and also Muslim voters, particularly in Michigan. And that's a good thing. It's good that people listen to their electorates, they listen to their constituencies, and they're trying to stitch together a winning coalition, and that's perfectly acceptable. Whether they can pull this off is another question. I think it's a very difficult election to call at the moment. It seems very evenly balanced. But I think in that context, yes, I think what's going on in the Middle East can have an influence on the election, given that the election is so finely balanced. It's so evenly placed at the moment.
And I think the balance is the word there, because the issue of what's happening there in Gaza has created an issue, has been a balance that many Western democratic governments who are going through election cycles have had to deal with on that level. And in talking of which, back in the UK, Starmer's government have decided to limit arms sales to Israel. Did you see that coming? What do you think of that?
I saw it coming. I think it was, to my mind, quite a gesture, more gesture politics, because I think they're stopping 35 weapons, but that's out of about 350, is my understanding. So I don't think it'll make that much difference on the ground. But it is a gesture, I suppose, in this appalling conflict. And the other thing you've got to remember with Labour is that they lost a handful of seats to a party, to a number of independents who were focusing exclusively on this Gaza issue, and felt that the Labour opposition was not representing the hopes and aspirations of the Palestinian people and the appalling attacks there. And they won seats in Parliament, in the British Parliament, only 2 months ago. My view is that Labour, in order to keep together their coalition, are trying now to appeal to people who are very, very sceptical of Israel's motives and actions in Gaza.
I think it is interesting, going back to that point in the conversation that we had earlier about the UK standing in the world, because it can't be isolated anymore. It can't be, and never has it ever. It's always been a trading hub and an international hub, but increasingly globalised world, increasingly you see these types of conflicts affecting things like elections in the UK and the US, amongst other things. So that's why I'm interested to know, what are you planning to do now, post-parliamentary career? Are you thinking of more international career for
Well, lots of things. Yeah, lots of things. I mean, I've always had an international interest. When I was in Parliament, I was vice chairman of something called the Conservative Middle East Council as a backbencher. I travelled as a minister to the United States, to the Gulf, a number of other places. My own family background is West African. Those of you who know West Africa will know that Kwasi is a very common name. It doesn't mean born on a Sunday, but it's a name given to males born on a Sunday, that sort of thing. And so my background and my interests, I've written about empire in the past. My interests are very much international focused. Obviously, I'm a great British patriot. I love my country, but I'm also interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. And I suspect going forward, I will be engaged more internationally. Because as an MP, you can't just travel willy-nilly to other parts of the world. You know, you've got to be there you've got to be in Westminster for parliamentary votes. You've obviously got to look after the needs and of your constituents. So you're very much rooted in the UK. I think having left the British Parliament, I think the international dimension becomes more interesting and accessible.
Certainly, you've got the freedom to roam now. Look, Kwasi Kwarteng, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure to you. Thank you.
That is all we've got time for on Global News today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews and debate. Until then, good night.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation. From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
In a journey that is rich in its content and substantiated by its details, from primitive cave drawings to the engraving of letters on stones, it set out. Writing was invented, and the alphabet shortly followed. And is the case in all journeys. What is new is the title. When you are facing a manuscript, it is inevitable that time will simply fleet you as you enter a meditative state. As you wipe the dust off of it, the fragrance of history captivates you. You begin to visualize the very fingertips of those who created this fine craft that they excelled in. The first calligraphers excelled in their precision and artwork skills. They added diacritics, and with ink and tools they wrote it all out, and they decorated them with their motifs. These are the messages of light, passed on through the history of Arab manuscripts. When you are facing a manuscript, it is inevitable that time will simply fleet you as you enter a meditative state. As you wipe the dust off of it, the fragrance of history captivates you. You begin to visualize the very fingertips of those who created this fine craft that they excelled in. When you have the opportunity to handle a manuscript, you'll begin to wonder, how were these papers made? How were all these manuscripts written and duplicated? How did they last long enough to reach us in a state of fine quality, grace, and elegance? They bear the history of the Arabs, preserving their intellectual prowess in all the fields of knowledge. All of this confirms the importance of Arab manuscripts and reflects how skillful and capable ancient Arab manufacturing had become. The manuscript industry was based on four main pillars. The appearance and material the paper was made of was the first and most important pillar, especially paper that was made from papyrus plant, and parchment that was made from animal skin, and paper that was made of linen and hemp. The second of these pillars was the ink and midad that was used, and the various colors that were selected. The third pillar was the pen that was used, which included the associated tools and calligraphy methods that were used. Binding was the fourth and final pillar in the production of an Arab manuscript. Sources make varying claims regarding the kind of paper used in manufacturing manuscripts. It mostly depends on the raw material that the paper was made of. Besides parchment, Papyrus was widespread, and it reigned supreme for an extended period of time until paper, or al-kaghid, was invented and was deemed a fierce competitor to them. It reached its zenith in the middle of the 5th century Hijri. It replaced papyrus, and the printing presses that began to use paper were more common and prevalent. The Arabs of the pre-Islamic era and Islam were familiar with papyrus, which was known as al-Qaratis. As an important material used for writing, it was even mentioned in their poetry. Tarafa bin al-Abd likened the face of his beloved to al-Qurtas from the Levant, as it is white and pure. Their cheek is similar to al-Qurtas from the Levant, and was encrypted like a Yemeni stone that had not been exposed. Papyrus constituted an important leap in the manuscript industry. It led to developments in the authorship and inscribing processes, and also helped spread information across vast distances because of the advantages this paper had. It was light, non-cumbersome to store and transport. The paper could even be transported through the folds of clothing. The papyrus plant would grow abundantly in the swamps of the river delta in ancient times. The ancient Egyptians benefited from it, and it resulted in the development of one of the most important industries, which are considered one of the greatest accomplishments that Egypt had offered human civilization, that being the paper-making industry. From this papyrus plant, paper is made. It is one of the most important agricultural crops that grew in the swamps of the delta in Egypt. And there are various species of it present in Sudan till this very day. They served many purposes in ancient Egypt, which ranged from making boxes, baskets, and ropes, but its core value lies within its use in making paper. Egypt was considered a center for this important industry, and it began to export a large portion of what they produced to the countries of the ancient world. The papyrus plant is from the sedge family of plants that belongs to the cypress genus and the papyrus species. The word paper is derived from papyrus, and it is what we use in the English language. The length of the papyrus plant ranges from 7 to 10 feet, and it is made of a trisection stem. Its bark is thin and coarse, and a width of a single reed is about 1.5 inches. The reed has a core made of cellular tissue, which paper is made out of. The reed is split into two, and each half is sliced from the center of the stem. The pulp slices are then placed side by side on flat wooden surfaces. A second set of these slices are placed perpendicularly to the first layer, and they are stacked side by side. These slices are then soaked and are gently pressed with pieces of wood until they level out. They are then left to dry in the sun. The end result is a piece of paper ranging in its size from 20 to 30 centimeters in width and 30 to 40 centimeters in length. It is easy to make files of varying lengths out of papyrus. Separate papers are bound together, where they are polished and pasted again until we obtain a roll that can reach 15 meters in length. Only one side of the papyrus would be used for writing, and it would be the side that had fibers that were horizontal, so that the pen that was used would be able to write with little to no resistance. The papyrus roll is then cut up into equal pieces, which are then written on and stacked on top of each other. It is used in corresponding messages, pamphlets, and manuscripts. Everything that nature made available to mankind has been used to aid them. Here we have papyrus paper. Thousands of them are preserved in libraries around the world. The Phoenicians transferred them to people around the world. We have received many letters and instruments that were written and described on papyrus, including papyrus from Hierakonpolis Magna. This papyrus dates back to 22 Hijri. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo has the oldest manuscript that is written on papyrus. This manuscript dates back to 4,500 years ago, and it contains details about the work the builders of the pyramid of the pharaoh Khufu partook in. It was found by a team of French and Egyptian archaeologists in Wadi al-Jarf on the coast of the Red Sea. Unfortunately, only fragments of the early works of Arab manuscripts that were written on papyrus have made their way to us. Among them are Mawti'a Malik bin Anas, the Journal of Humam bin Munabbih, and the Journal of Abdullah bin al-Hayya. The most complete manuscript that has reached us that was written on papyrus is the book titled A Collection of Prophetic Hadiths by Abdullah bin Wahb, who passed away in the year 97 Hijri in the region of Idfu in Upper Egypt, and it is now preserved in the Egyptian National Library. The year 323 Hijri witnessed the last known use of papyrus for writing as of now, as that century would be the last to witness the manufacturing of papyrus paper. With these words, we toured around the world of ancient papers, and in our modern times, we witnessed its great legacy, and in the lives of the ancients, it was a point of skill and craftsmanship. Phenomenal human innovation was written down upon their papyri, which still shines on till this very day.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.